Charlotte Whitmore reached up and lifted her own trunk down from the stagecoach before a single man in Red Hollow could deny her the courtesy. The whole town watched. Not one hand moved to help her. "She won't last a week up that mountain," a woman whispered behind a fan. "Too big for the frontier." Charlotte heard it. She'd crossed 1,000 miles to marry a stranger nobody wanted, and now she stood alone in the dust, judged before she'd spoken one word. If you love stories where the rejected finally find their worth, subscribe and stay with me all the way to the end. And tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? I want to see just how far this story travels. The stagecoach rolled into Red Hollow, Montana on the hottest afternoon of the summer of 1884, and the whole town seemed to be waiting for it. They weren't waiting for the mail. They weren't waiting for supplies. They were waiting to see her. Word had traveled up and down the valley for 3 weeks. The lonely cowboy on the mountain had sent away for a bride, a mail-order woman. And when the driver's manifest passed through the general store, folks had learned her name, and one detail besides. She was heavy, not plump, not full-figured the way a rancher's wife got after a few good winters. Heavy. The kind of heavy that made men laugh behind their hands and women press their lips together in that careful, cruel way that pretended to be pity. So they gathered, on the boardwalk outside Hargrove's store, on the steps of the church, in the doorway of the saloon where men leaned with their thumbs in their belts and their hats pushed back ready for a show. The coach stopped. The horses stamped and blew, and Charlotte Whitmore looked out the window at every one of them. She saw the whispers before she heard them. She'd learned to read whispers the way other folks read weather, by the tightening of a mouth, the flick of an eye, the sudden interest a body took in the person beside them. "That's her. Lord have mercy." He ordered that from a catalog. The driver climbed down. He was a young fellow no more than 20, and he had the decency to look uncomfortable. He opened the coach door. "Red Hollow, ma'am," he said. "Thank you kindly," Charlotte said. She gathered her skirt. She set one foot on the step, and the whole town held its breath, waiting for the step to groan, waiting for her to stumble, waiting for something to laugh at. She did not give it to them. She stepped down clean and steady, one hand on the coach rail, and she stood in the dust of Red Hollow, with her chin level and her brown eyes moving slow across the crowd. 25 years old. A round, gentle face. Dark hair braided simple down her back. A traveling dress worn thin at the cuffs from too many miles. Nobody moved to greet her. "Miss Whitmore," the driver asked, quieter now. "You got trunks up top. You want me to fetch a man to—" "I'll manage," she said. "Ma'am, they're heavy." "So am I," she said. "We'll get on fine." A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. Charlotte heard it and did not flinch. She walked to the back of the coach, reached up, and hauled her own trunk down off the rack. It landed in the dust with a thud. She reached for the second. Nobody helped her. A woman in a fine blue dress stood on the boardwalk with a fan, and she leaned toward her companion and said not softly enough, "Well, at least she's strong as an ox. He'll need it way up there." "Marion," her companion murmured. "I'm only saying what everybody's thinking." Charlotte pulled the second trunk down. She set it beside the first. She straightened and she pressed a strand of hair off her damp forehead, and she turned to face the town that had come to look at her. "Afternoon?" she said. "Just that, loud enough to carry. I'm Charlotte Whitmore. I've come a long way, and I'd be grateful for water if anyone's got some to spare." Silence. Not one soul answered her. A boy of maybe 8 tugged his mother's sleeve. "Mama, why is she so—" "Hush!" The mother yanked him back and turned him toward the store, but she looked at Charlotte over her shoulder as she went, and there was no kindness in it. Charlotte's throat worked. She'd asked for water. In a town in the middle of a Montana summer, she'd asked for water, and 40 people had stared at her like she'd asked for the moon. She had known it would be like this. She'd told herself all the long miles from Ohio that she had known. That she'd been ready. She was not ready. A body was never ready. "I reckon," said a voice from the saloon steps. "He sent for her by the pound." The saloon men laughed. "Bet the freight cost more than the woman," another said. More laughter. Louder. Charlotte turned toward them slow. She had a way of turning, of setting her feet that was neither meek nor angry, and it made the laughter falter just a little because it was not the reaction they'd wanted. "You're funny men," she said. "I'll bet your wives laugh all day." One of them, big red-faced, a scar through one eyebrow, stepped down off the porch. "What'd you say to me, girl? I said you must be a joy to come home to." "Cole," a woman's sharp voice. "Leave it be. She ain't worth the sweat." The big man, Cole, looked at Charlotte a long moment. Then he spat in the dust between them, and he laughed, and he turned back to his friends. "You're right. She ain't." Charlotte breathed out through her nose. Her hands at her sides were shaking. She made them stop. "You've been here 2 minutes," she told herself. 2 minutes, and not one kind word. This is the town. This is the place. This is where you've come to make a life. And then from the far end of the street, a horse. It came at a walk, unhurried, and the man on its back sat easy in the saddle, the way only a man who'd spent his life horseback could sit. He was big, not fat, but broad and tall and hard through the shoulders, and he wore a dust-gray coat and a hat pulled low, and his face, what could be seen of it, was weathered to the color of old leather. The crowd's attention shifted from Charlotte to him, and Charlotte felt it shift. Felt the town turn like a single animal, and she heard the new whispers start. "There he is. That's Walker. Lord, this'll be something." The cowboy rode up the middle of the street and did not look at the town at all. He looked at Charlotte, only at Charlotte. And when he was near enough, he drew rein and he sat there above her, a tall shape against the sky. And for a long moment, he didn't say anything. Charlotte lifted her chin and looked back at him. "Go on," she thought. "Look. Everybody's looked. Have your turn." Ethan Walker looked. He looked at her the way the town had, but it was not the same, and she couldn't have said how she knew, but she knew. The town had looked at her body and stopped there. This man's eyes went past it. They found her face. They found the flush of shame on it, and the water she'd asked for and been refused, and the trunk she'd hauled down herself, and the set of her mouth that was trying so hard to be brave. Then he swung down off the horse. He did it easy, one long motion, and he stood a full head taller than she did, and he took his hat off. Just took it clean off his head, and held it against his chest the way a man does for a lady. The whole street went quiet. Ethan Walker did not seem to notice. He looked at Charlotte, and he said in a low, rough voice that had gone rusty from disuse, "Ma'am, you look tired." Charlotte's breath caught. "Did anybody offer you water?" he asked. For a moment she couldn't speak. It was such a small thing. It was nothing at all. A man had asked if she'd been offered water, and it was the first kind word anyone had said to her in Red Hollow, and it was the first kind word anyone had said to her in a long, long time before that, and it undid something in her chest so fast and so hard that she had to look down at the dust to keep from shaming herself with tears. "No," she said. "No, sir, they didn't." Something moved across Ethan Walker's face. Not surprise. He wasn't surprised. Something older and harder than surprise. He put his hat back on. He turned slow and he looked at the town. He looked at the men on the saloon steps. He looked at the woman with the fan. He looked at the mother who'd yanked her boy away, and the storekeeper standing in his doorway with his arms crossed, and every last soul who'd come out to gawk and laugh and not lift a hand. This lady, Ethan said, asked for water. Nobody answered. "In July," he said, after a week on the road. The storekeeper shifted his weight. "Now Walker." "Amos." Ethan's voice didn't rise. It got quieter, and somehow that was worse. "You got a whole barrel not 10 feet behind you, and you stood there." "Amos," the storekeeper's mouth opened and closed. "Every one of you stood there," Ethan said. He turned in a slow circle and the town could not meet his eyes. All those bold, laughing people, they looked at their boots and their fans and the sky. "I've lived up that mountain 16 years, come down twice a season, and I always figured Red Hollow for a hard town, but a decent one." He shook his head once. "I figured wrong." "She's a stranger," someone said. "She's a woman come to be married," Ethan said. "Who asked for a cup of water and you laughed at her?" He let that sit. "That ain't hardness. That's meanness. And there's a difference, though. I don't expect you to see it." He turned his back on all of them. He walked to the store, and he lifted the dipper from the water barrel himself, and he filled a tin cup, and he carried it back across the street through the dead quiet crowd, and he held it out to Charlotte with his own hand. "Ma'am," he said. Charlotte took the cup. Her fingers brushed his. His hand was enormous and rough as bark and warm. "Thank you," she whispered. "No thanks needed for water," he said. "Any decent place would have given it before you asked." She drank. She hadn't known how thirsty she was until the water hit her throat and she drank the whole cup down, and Ethan Walker stood between her and the town like a wall while she did it, so that not one of them could look at her drinking. When she'd finished, she handed the cup back. "Better?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "Good." He glanced at her trunks. "These yours?" "They are." "I'll load 'em." He bent for one, and Charlotte moved to help, and he said, "No, you've hauled enough today. Sit down there in the shade a spell. Wagons around back of the store." "You came in a wagon. Rode in to fetch you and drove the wagon in yesterday for supplies." He hefted her trunk onto his shoulder like it weighed nothing. "Figured you'd have things. Figured a lady oughtn't ride 2 hours to the mountain on the back of a horse her first day." Charlotte watched him carry her trunk toward the alley, and she thought, he planned. He thought about it. He thought about me sitting on a wagon seat instead of a saddle, a woman he'd never met, and he drove down a day early to make it easier. Nobody had thought about making things easier for her in a very long time. She sat on the store steps in the shade the way he'd told her to, and the town slowly came back to life around her, but quieter now, chasing the laughter gone underground. The woman with the blue fan gathered her skirts and went into the store, and did not look at Charlotte as she passed. The saloon men drifted back inside. Only the little boy stayed. He crept up to the bottom of the steps and looked at Charlotte with round, honest eyes. "Are you going to live on the mountain?" he asked. "I reckon I am," Charlotte said. "There's bears up there." "Is there now?" "And it snows so deep the cabins get buried. My pa says nobody but a crazy man'd live up there." "Well?" Charlotte smiled at him, a real smile, the first one since she'd stepped off the coach. "Maybe I'm a crazy woman. That'd make 2 of us up there, wouldn't it?" The boy grinned, gap-toothed. "You're funny." "Danny," the mother's voice again. "Get away from there." The boy scampered off, and Charlotte's smile faded, and she folded her hands in her lap and waited. When Ethan brought the wagon around, he climbed down and offered her his hand up to the seat, and Charlotte hesitated, not because she didn't want to take it, but because she was heavy, and men had refused her their hands before, or worse, had taken her weight, and grunted at it, and made a face, and the humiliation of that was a particular thing she'd hoped never to feel again. Ethan saw her hesitate. He didn't take his hand back. "I've pulled 300-pound calves out of bog," he said, plain as anything, "and hauled full-grown men off horses. You take my hand, ma'am. It'll hold." So she took it, and it held. He handed her up onto the wagon seat like it was nothing at all, like she was nothing at all to lift, and he went around and climbed up the other side, and he took the reins. 2 hours to the ranch," he said. "You want to stop for the necessary, or anything to eat, you say so. No shame in it." "I'm fine," Charlotte said. "All right." He clucked to the team. The wagon lurched forward, and Charlotte Whitmore rode out of Red Hollow beside the loneliest man in Montana, past the last of the staring faces, out toward the blue wall of mountains in the west, and she did not look back. For the first while, neither of them spoke. Charlotte had spent enough time around silent men to know there were 2 kinds of silence, the kind that pushed you away and the kind that just was. This was the second kind. Ethan Walker drove with his eyes on the road and his big hands loose on the reins, and he didn't seem to expect her to fill the air, and after a while she found she was grateful for it. But there were things she needed to know. So finally she said, "Mr. Walker." "Ethan's fine." "Ethan?" She folded her hands. "I want to say a thing, and I want to say it plain if that suits you." "Plain suits me." "You wrote to me, through the agency, 3 letters. She looked at her hands. You never once asked what I looked like. You never asked my size. The agency, they don't always tell a man unless he asks, and you never asked. No. Why not? Ethan was quiet a moment. The wagon rocked. Because it weren't my business, he said, what a woman looked like. It was my business whether she could keep a house and stand a hard life and wanted a family. You said you could. You said you did. He shrugged one big shoulder. That's what I asked after. That's what I got answered. And now you've seen me. Now I've seen you. Charlotte made herself say it. The town thinks you got cheated. The town, Ethan said, can go hang. Charlotte laughed. It surprised her, the laugh. It came out sharp and startled and real. Ethan glanced at her sidelong, and something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth, and then it was gone. I'll tell you how it is, ma'am. Charlotte. Charlotte. He said it careful, like he was trying the shape of it. I'll tell you how it is, Charlotte. I've lived alone 16 years. I know how to be alone. I'm good at it. Too good, maybe. The reins shifted in his hands. I didn't send for a bride 'cause I couldn't bear another night by myself. I sent 'cause I'm getting on toward 40 and a man wants... He stopped, started again. A man wants his life to have meant something, wants a hand to reach for in the dark, wants somebody at his table. That's all. That's the whole of it. I wasn't looking for a picture out of a catalog. I was looking for a person willing to build a thing alongside me. That's a fine thing to want, Charlotte said quietly. Question is whether you still want it, Ethan said. Now you've seen the town and can guess at the winters and know a little more of what you signed on for. 'Cause I'll tell you now, and I'll only say it once if you've changed your mind. If you want to go back east, I'll drive you to the coach myself and pay your fare, and there'll be no hard word between us. I won't hold a woman to a bargain she made blind. Charlotte looked at him. He meant it. She could hear that he meant it. He'd give her the way out freely and never blame her, this man who'd waited 16 years and finally sent away for a wife and had the whole valley laughing at what showed up. He'd drive her back and let her go and return to his mountain alone. Do you want me to go? She asked. That ain't what I asked. I know. I'm asking you. She held his eyes. Do you want me to go? Ethan Walker looked back at the road. His jaw worked. It was a long moment before he answered, and when he did, his voice was rough. No, he said. I don't. Then I'm not going anywhere, Charlotte said. I didn't cross a country to run from a mean town. I've had mean towns my whole life. Ohio was full of them. If I ran from the first cruel word, I'd have died running. She lifted her chin. I came to build a thing alongside a decent man. You're the first decent man I've met in a year of Sundays, Ethan Walker. I'm staying. The wagon rolled on. The mountains grew closer, taller, bluer. All right then, Ethan said. And that was all. But she saw his shoulders ease just slightly, like a man setting down a weight he'd carried a long way. They stopped once at a creek to water the horses. Ethan handed her down, and she walked a little way along the bank to stretch, and when she came back, he'd unpacked a cloth from under the seat. Bread and hard cheese and dried apples. Figured you'd be hungry, he said. Store bread, ain't much. You keep thinking about me being hungry and tired, Charlotte said, taking the bread. Long way to the mountain, he said. Like that explained it. They ate standing by the creek. And Charlotte, watching him tear bread with those big hands working up her nerve, finally asked the thing she'd been wanting to ask. Ethan, is there... She stopped. The agency letters. You wrote them yourself. Every word. And there's nobody else up there on the mountain. Nobody. Just me. And the stock. He chewed. 2 hired men in the busy season, but they've got their own cabin down the draw, and they don't come to the house. So it's been just you, all this time. Just me. He looked out at the water. Wasn't always the plan, but it's how it worked out. What happened? She asked. And then quickly, you don't have to say. I'm sorry. It's not my... You'll be my wife, Ethan said. You've got a right to know who you're marrying. He was quiet a moment. Then, I had folks once, came out from Kentucky when I was a boy. My daddy took up that mountain ground nobody else wanted, too high, too hard, they said. But he was stubborn, and he made it pay. Cattle mostly. Some horses. He turned a piece of bread over in his fingers. Winter, I was 22. There was a sickness came through. Took my mother in 3 days. My daddy a week after. His voice didn't change, but it got lower. I buried them both up there side by side, under the big pine behind the house. Ground was froze so hard it took me 2 days apiece to dig. Ethan, Charlotte breathed. I was set to be married back then, he went on. Girl from the valley, Susanna. We had it planned for the spring. He shook his head slowly. After my folks passed, she said she couldn't. Said she couldn't live up on that mountain with all that death in the ground, married to a man with nothing but grief and 100 head of cattle. Said she wanted a life in town with people around and dances and neighbors. He was quiet. She married a fellow in Helena that summer. Feed store man. I heard she's got 5 children now. Charlotte's throat ached. I'm sorry. Long time ago. That doesn't mean it don't still hurt. Ethan looked at her, and something flickered in his eyes. Surprise maybe that she'd seen it, that she'd said the true thing instead of the polite one. No, he admitted. I reckon it don't. So you stayed up there, Charlotte said. Alone, 16 years. Where was I going to go? He said it without self-pity, just fact. It's my ground. My folks are in it. The stock needed working. And after Susanna, He stopped. I decided a man like me was made for that kind of living. Alone on a hard mountain doing hard work till he dies. Figured that was the shape of my life, and I'd best make peace with it. And then you sent for me. Ethan didn't answer that right away. He wrapped the bread back in its cloth careful, and he looked up at the mountains going gold in the westering light. Man gets tired, he said finally, of making peace with a thing that hurts. They didn't talk much after that, but it was a different quiet than before. It had something in it now. The last stretch of road climbed, and the horses leaned into their collars, and the air went thin and cool, and smelled of pine, and the sun dropped toward the peaks. And then the road bent, and Ethan drew rein, and he said, There it is, home. Charlotte looked. The ranch sat in a high park, where the timber opened up a big log house, weathered gray with a stone chimney, and a deep porch, a barn, corrals, outbuildings, and beyond them the pastures running up toward the tree line and the bare rock above. Cattle dotted the green. A creek came down bright out of the rocks and ran past the house. It was beautiful. And it was also, Charlotte saw it at once, with the eye of a woman who'd kept house her whole life. It was a place where nobody had made a home in a long, long time. There were no curtains in the windows. No garden by the house, only trampled dirt. No flowers. No washing on a line. No chicken scratching, none of the small 100 signs of a woman's care. It was a working ranch, kept alive by a working man, and it had a barrenness to it, a hollowness that had nothing to do with the beauty of the land. It ain't much to look at close up, Ethan said. House needs work. I kept the barn better than the house, tell you the truth. Barn's where the money is. It's a fine place, Charlotte said. It's a beautiful place, Ethan. You say that now? I'll say it in January, too. He almost smiled again. He drove the wagon down into the park and up to the house, and he set the brake and climbed down and came around to hand her down, and Charlotte stood in the yard of the place that was to be her home, and she turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. Well, she said, you've been eating cold, haven't you? Ethan blinked. Ma'am, that chimney. She pointed. Half the smoke stains washed off. You haven't laid a proper cook fire in weeks. You've been eating cold, or eating out of a can, or eating whatever you could throw in a pan without minding it. She looked at him. Am I wrong? Ethan stared at her a moment. No, he admitted. You ain't wrong. When did you last have a hot meal, a real one? Bread, meat, greens, something a body sits down to. He had to think about it. That was the answer right there, that he had to think. Susanna, Charlotte said gently, was a fool. Ethan looked at her sharp. I don't mean it cruel, Charlotte said. I mean it plain. Any woman who'd walk away from a man who drives down the mountain a day early so she won't have to ride a horse tired who fills her water cup with his own hand in front of a town that laughed at her. She shook her head. That's a rare kind of a man. She was a fool to let you go. I don't care how much grief was in the ground. For a long moment, Ethan Walker didn't say anything. He stood in the yard with his hat in his hands and looked at this woman. The whole valley had laughed at, and something was working in his weathered face that he clearly didn't have words for. Charlotte, he said finally. Yes, he cleared his throat. There's a room made up for you, the East Room. Good room gets the morning sun. I built the bed frame myself last month. Stuffed a new tick. Fresh. He was talking fast now, gruff, uncomfortable. I mean to say, I ain't expecting we ain't married yet, and I ain't the kind of man who'd you'll have your own room is what I'm saying. Till we stand up in front of the preacher proper, and after that too, if that's what you... He stopped, red under the leather of his face. I'm making a mess of this. You're doing fine, Charlotte said softly. I just mean you're safe here, he said. That's the whole of it. You're safe. Nobody up here'll ever say a mean word to you, not while I draw breath. And Charlotte Whitmore, who had been laughed at in the street 4 hours before, who had been refused a cup of water, who had hauled her own trunks and taken a stranger's hand and prayed it would hold. Charlotte stood in the high golden light of the mountain and felt something she had not felt in longer than she could rightly remember. She felt safe. Ethan, she said, would you show me the kitchen? The kitchen. It's a wreck, I told you. I know. Show me anyway. She started rolling up her sleeves. Because you're going to have a hot supper tonight, mister, if I have to scrub that whole cabin down to do it. You've been eating cold too long. You just got here. You're worn to the bone. I've never been too worn to cook a decent meal for a decent man, Charlotte said. Now show me your kitchen, and then you go see to your horses, and by the time it's full dark, this house is going to smell like a home for the first time in 16 years. You hear me? Ethan Walker looked at her. And then the loneliest man in Montana did a thing the town of Red Hollow would never in 100 years have believed. He smiled a real smile, wide and sudden, and years too long in coming, and it changed his whole hard face, and he said, Yes, ma'am, this way. The kitchen was every bit the wreck he'd promised. A cold stove furred with old grease, a dry water bucket, shelves half bare, and what was on them a bachelor's sorry stores. Coffee salt pork, a sack of flour, gone a little weevily at the top, some cans, a crock of lard. A table with one chair, one plate, one cup, one fork, all clean, all sitting exactly where a solitary man had left them. Charlotte took it all in, and she didn't say a word about it. And Ethan watched her not saying a word about it, and seemed to brace for it anyhow. It's bad, he said. It's a stove and a roof and food to cook, Charlotte said, tying an apron she'd pulled from her own trunk around her waist. That's more than plenty. Now, where's your woodpile? Where's your water? And is that a smokehouse I saw out back? It is. There's a side of bacon in it and some venison I put up. Venison. Charlotte's eyes lit. You've got venison and you've been eating out of cans? I don't rightly know what to do with it past frying it hard, Ethan admitted. Lord have mercy, Charlotte said. You poor man. Go see to your horses. Go on. And bring me in an armload of that wood on your way the dry kind, and then leave me be. Supper in 2 hours. And Ethan Walker, who gave orders to hired men, and broke horses, and had faced down a whole town, not 6 hours past went meek as a lamb to fetch his own firewood, because a woman in his kitchen told him to. And when he came back with the wood and set it in the box, he stood a moment in the doorway, watching her move through his sorry bachelor kitchen like she'd been born in it. Pumping water, wiping down the stove, coaxing a fire to life, humming under her breath, and there was a look on his face that Charlotte pretended not to see. You're letting the flies in, she said without turning around. Right, Ethan said. Sorry. And he went. But he stopped halfway across the yard, and he looked back at the house, at the chimney. where for the first time in a long time, smoke was starting to rise thin and gray and climbing up into the cooling mountain air. He stood there a good while watching that smoke. Then he went and saw to his horses. By full dark, the house smelled like a home. It smelled of wood smoke and bacon fat and rising bread and venison, braised slow with wild onion and the last of a sack of dried beans. It smelled of coffee. It smelled of a place where somebody lived and somebody cooked and somebody cared. Charlotte had done it in 2 hours flat, in a strange kitchen, exhausted from a week of travel and an afternoon of cruelty, and she'd sung the whole time low the way she always did when she cooked, and it was the first time in 16 years that anybody had sung in that house. Ethan came in when she called him. He'd washed at the trough. His hair was wet and combed back, and he'd put on a clean shirt, and Charlotte noticed and didn't say anything about it, but she noticed. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the table. She'd set a cloth she'd dug out of her own trunk, a second plate and cup she'd found in a crate, the food steaming in the middle of it all, and he didn't move. "Well, sit down," Charlotte said. "It'll go cold, and we've both had enough cold." He sat. Slow. Like a man in a dream. Charlotte fixed his plate herself and set it in front of him. Venison and beans and hot bread with butter she'd churned quick from cream she'd found in the spring house. And she sat down across from him with her own plate, and she folded her hands, and she said, "You want to say grace, or shall I?" "I." Ethan looked lost. "I ain't said grace in a lot of years." "Then I'll say it," Charlotte said, "and you can just listen." She bowed her head. "Lord, thank you for this food, and for the man who put it in this house, and for bringing me safe up this mountain to a decent place with a decent person in it. It's been a long time since I sat at a table with somebody kind. Thank you for it. Amen." "Amen," Ethan said low. And he picked up his fork, and he took a bite of the venison, and he stopped. He set down his fork. He looked at the plate. He looked at Charlotte, and his eyes, those hard, weathered eyes, had gone bright. "What is it?" Charlotte asked, suddenly worried. "Too much onion, I can—" "It's the best thing I ever ate," Ethan said. "Oh, hush. It's plain frontier cooking. It's nothing fancy. Charlotte." His voice cracked on her name. "I've been eating alone in this kitchen for 16 years. Cold biscuits, fried meat, coffee, alone. At this table with one chair, every night, for 16 years. He looked down at the plate again. "And tonight there's 2 chairs, and there's Grace said, and there's this food, and there's somebody across from me, and I—" He stopped. He pressed the back of one big hand hard against his mouth. "I'm sorry. I don't know what's the matter with me." "There's nothing the matter with you," Charlotte said softly. "You're just not used to being taken care of. That's all it is. A body forgets what it feels like." "Yeah," Ethan said thickly. "I reckon it does." They ate. And they talked about the ranch and the stock and the winters and what needed doing. And slowly the rawness went out of it. And it became just 2 people at a table, easy the way it was supposed to be. Charlotte told him about Ohio, a little not the worst of it, not yet, but enough. That she'd lost her mother young. That her father had run a boarding house and she'd cooked for it since she was 12. That after he died, the boarding house went to a cousin who didn't want her in it, and she'd worked as the cook here and there, and been let go from more than one place. Not for her cooking, but for how she looked. Because a fat cook was bad for business, a fine lady had told her once, as if that were a reasonable thing to say to a person. "She said that to you." Ethan's jaw had gone tight. "Straight to your face. Straight to my face. And paid me off and sent me on." Charlotte shrugged, but it cost her. "That's when I answered the agency. Figured out west at least a woman's judged by whether she can do the work, not just by—" She gestured at herself. "By this. Out west," Ethan said. "She ought to be. Some places she is." His hand tightened on his cup. "But you saw Red Hollow." "I saw Red Hollow. They'll come around. Maybe. Maybe not." Charlotte looked at him steady. "It doesn't much matter to me if they do, Ethan. I didn't come up here for Red Hollow. I came for the mountain. And the man on it. Ethan held her eyes across the table, across the food she'd made in the warm, smoky light of the first fire she'd laid in his cold house. "Charlotte," he said, "I know we agreed on a wedding come the preacher's next circuit through. 3 weeks off." "We did. I don't want to wait 3 weeks." He said it plain and fast, like a man jumping into cold water. "I don't. That ain't me being forward. I told you. You'll have your own room. I mean the standing up part, the proper part, the I want it done. I want you to be my wife, and not a woman folks can call a mail-order bride and snicker over. I want to ride into Red Hollow with a ring on your hand and dare any man to say a word. I want—" He ran out of breath. "I want you to belong here. Legal and proper and nobody's business. As quick as it can be done." Charlotte's heart was pounding. "There's a preacher 2 valleys over," Ethan said. "Old Pruitt. He's a day's ride, but he's a good man, and he'll come if I ask. I could send one of the hands tomorrow. Have him up here in 3 days. He looked at her, and for all his size he looked young and scared and hopeful. If that's what you'd want, if you'd have me quick, if you'd have me at all." Charlotte Whitmore sat in the warm kitchen of the loneliest man in Montana, on the day the whole world had laughed at her, and she looked at the smoke rising, and the second chair filled, and the good man across the table asking her, the woman too big to love the woman, not worth a cup of water, asking her to be his wife as quick as it could be done. "Ethan Walker," she said, and her voice shook. "Send for the preacher." Ethan closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet, and he didn't try to hide it, and he reached across the table, across the food and the cloth and the 16 years of cold suppers, and he took Charlotte's hand in his enormous one, the hand she used to hide because people judged it, and he held it like it was something precious. "I'll send at first light," he said. "I'll send at first light, Charlotte." And outside, up on that hard, high mountain, where a man had buried his whole family and made his lonely peace with a lonely life, the smoke kept rising from the chimney into the summer dark, and for the first time in 16 years, it did not rise over an empty house. But down in the valley in the town of Red Hollow, other people were talking too. In the saloon over cards, on lamplit porches, in the fine parlor of the biggest ranch house in the county, where a wealthy man named Sterling Vance heard from his foreman that the crazy mountain cowboy had actually gone and married the fat woman from the catalog, and Sterling Vance, who had wanted Ethan Walker's high water and Ethan Walker's mountain grass for a long, long time, and who did not like Ethan Walker, and who liked even less the idea of that stubborn hermit finally being happy, set down his brandy and smiled a slow smile and said to his foreman, "Is that so?" The hired man Ethan sent for the preacher was gone before Charlotte had finished frying the morning bacon, and she watched him ride out from the porch with a mug of coffee going cold in her hands. "His name's Cole," she asked when Ethan came up beside her. "Cole Perry. Good hand. Been with me 4 years. Ethan took the coffee she offered. "Why, nothing. A man in the saloon yesterday was called Cole. Big fellow. Spat in the dirt at me." Ethan's face went still. "That'd be Cole Danvers. Different man. That one works for Sterling Vance." He drank. "You stay clear of him." "I intend to stay clear of the whole town." "Good." But Charlotte had learned to hear the thing underneath a thing, and there was something underneath the way Ethan said that name. "Who's Sterling Vance?" "Nobody you need to think about." He handed back the mug. "I got to move cattle up to the high pasture today. Take both hands. We'll be gone till dark. You'll be all right here. I've been alone in worse places than a beautiful mountain. Doors bar from the inside. Rifles over the mantel loaded. You know how to use one. My daddy taught me at 9. Something eased in him. Course he did." He settled his hat. "There's bear this time of year and cats, but they don't come near the house in daylight. Anybody rides in you don't know, you don't open that door. You hear, 'Who would ride in Charlotte?'" He didn't smile. "You hear me?" "I hear you," she said, and she meant to ask him again about Sterling Vance, but he was already swinging up onto his horse, and the two of them, Ethan and the second hand, rode off into the timber, with the dogs running ahead, and she was alone. She was not idle a single minute of that day. By the time the sun stood overhead, she had scrubbed the kitchen down to the wood hauled out 3 seasons of a bachelor's neglect, blackened the stove, scoured every pot, and washed and hung the one set of curtains she'd brought from Ohio across the window over the wash basin. She found the spring house and set it right. She found the garden plot choked with weed and stood over it a long while with her hands on her hips planning. She found a root cellar half caved and made a note to have Ethan see to it. And in the barn, she found something that stopped her cold, a cradle. It sat under a tarp in the loft, and she'd only found it looking for burlap, and she pulled the canvas back. And there it was, a cradle, hand-carved, the wood worn smooth old. A baby's cradle in a house where no baby had ever slept in Ethan's lifetime. His mother's, she thought. His own, maybe. Carried out from Kentucky in a wagon. Kept. She covered it back up careful and climbed down and said nothing about it. Some things a woman held till the man was ready to speak them. They came in at dark, all 3 of them, and the second hand, a young sandy fellow named Tom Brennan, took one look at the kitchen and stopped in the doorway with his hat in his hand. "Ma'am," he said, "that you did all this. It's just clean, Tom. It's not a miracle." "No, ma'am, but—" He looked around, and he looked at Ethan, and he grinned. "Boss, it don't even smell the same in here." "It don't," Ethan agreed. "Sit down, both of you," Charlotte said. "There's stew, and there's biscuits, and Tom, you're too thin, so you'll have 2 helpings whether you want them or not." Tom Brennan sat down at Ethan Walker's table, and ate 2 helpings, and then a third, and he talked the whole time about the cattle, and the high grass, and a she-bear they'd seen with cubs. And Charlotte watched Ethan across the table, watching his young hand laugh and eat and talk, in a house that had been silent for 16 years. And she saw the thing move across Ethan's face again, the thing he didn't have words for. When Tom had gone off to the Hand's cabin down the draw, full and happy, Ethan lingered. "He'll tell it all over the valley now," Ethan said. "That the mountain's got a woman in it who feeds a man like that. Is that bad?" "No." Ethan looked at his hands. "No, it ain't bad." He was quiet. "It's just folks are going to have things to say, Charlotte, when we ride down for the wedding. When word gets around, there'll be things said. I want you braced for it." "I've been braced my whole life," she said. "Don't you worry about me." But she saw that he did worry, and she thought again about the name he wouldn't explain, and she let it lie one more night. The days after that ran together the good way, the way full days do. She got the garden turned. Tom helped her, and Ethan grumbled about her lifting and then hauled the heavy loads himself. She put in what would still make in a short mountain season greens, turnips, beans, squash. She got the henhouse standing again, and Ethan rode down to a homestead in the foothills and came back with a dozen laying hens crated on the back of a mule. And the first morning she gathered eggs. She stood in the yard and laughed out loud at nothing, at the plain joy of a warm egg in her hand, in a place that was becoming hers. She learned the horses. Ethan had 11 head saddle stock and 2 teams, and she learned everyone learned which was gentle and which would nip, learned to talk to them low. The way Ethan did, learned that the big gray gelding, the one Ethan rode, was called Smoke, and was the only creature on that mountain Ethan had let himself love in 16 years. He was a colt when Susanna left, Ethan told her once, currying the gray in the evening. "Broke him that same summer. Reckon I put a lot into that horse I didn't have nowhere else to put. He's a fine horse. He's a better friend than most men I've known." Ethan ran a hand down the gray's neck. "Never laughed at me, never left, just carried me where I needed and stood where I told him." He looked at Charlotte over the horse's back. "First time in a long time I got something in this house I care about more than a horse." Charlotte's breath caught. "Ethan Walker, was that a sweet thing you just said to me? Don't make it a whole to-do." "I'll make it exactly as much of a to-do as I please," she said, and she went to him around the horse and stood on her toes and kissed him quick on his weathered cheek, and Ethan Walker went red to the roots of his hair and didn't say a word, but he smiled all through supper. The preacher came on the 4th day. Cole Perry rode in ahead to say he was coming, and Charlotte scrambled. There was no time for a dress made, but she had one good dress she'd carried from Ohio Blue that she'd been saving, and she pressed it and put up her hair and pinched her cheeks in a bit of broken mirror and stood back and looked at herself and thought plainly, without cruelty, because she'd made a peace with mirrors long ago. There you are. That's what he gets. A big plain woman in a blue dress. And he wants you anyway. Old Pruitt the preacher was a lean, weathered man with kind eyes and a Bible worn soft as cloth, and he married them on the porch of the log house in the gold of the late afternoon with Tom Brennan and Cole Perry standing witness in their clean shirts and the dogs lying in the yard and Smoke the Gray watching over the corral rail like he knew. "Do you, Ethan?" said Pruitt. "Take this woman." "I do," Ethan said before the preacher had finished. Pruitt's mouth twitched. "You want to hear the rest of it, son?" "I know the rest of it," Ethan said. "I do." And when it came Charlotte's turn, her voice was steady, and she looked up into the face of the man who'd filled her water cup in front of a jeering town, and she said, "I do." And she meant it more than she'd ever meant anything. Pruitt closed his soft Bible. "Then by the grace of God and the laws of the Montana Territory, I pronounce you man and wife. Ethan, you can—" But Ethan was already leaning down slow, careful, giving her every chance to turn away, and Charlotte did not turn away. And the loneliest man in Montana kissed his bride on the porch of his mountain home, while 2 cowhands whooped and a preacher laughed and the hens fussed in their yard. It was the finest day of Charlotte Whitmore's life. Charlotte Walker's life now. Pruitt stayed to supper and stayed the night and rode out at dawn with a sack of Charlotte's biscuits and a blessing. And then it was just the 2 of them and the hands and the ranch and the mountain and the long gold summer. And for 11 days it was near to heaven. But heaven, Charlotte had learned, was a thing the world could not leave be. It came on the 12th day in the shape of 3 riders coming up the road at noon. Charlotte saw them first from the garden. 3 men well-mounted riding easy, and even at a distance, she could tell they were not hired hands. The clothes were too fine, the horses too good, and something in the way they rode, taking their time looking the place over, as they came like men appraising a thing they meant to own. She remembered what Ethan had said. "Anybody rides in, you don't know you don't open that door." But Ethan was in the near pasture in sight, and she called to him, and he came at a jog, and he saw the 3 riders, and his whole body changed. "Get in the house," he said. "Ethan, Charlotte, in the house, now, please." It was the please that moved her. He'd never said it like that. She went to the porch, but no further, and she watched, and Ethan stood in the middle of his own yard, with his thumbs in his belt, and waited for the 3 men to ride up. The one in front was maybe 50 silver at the temples, dressed in a fine gray suit that had no business on a mountain, sitting a blood-bay horse worth more than most men made in a year. He had a soft, handsome face and cold, pale eyes, and he smiled when he drew rein, and the smile never got anywhere near the eyes. "Ethan Walker," the man said, warm as sunshine. "Been a coon's age." "Vance," Ethan said, and Charlotte's stomach dropped because there it was, the name that had no explanation, Sterling Vance, sitting his fine horse in her yard, smiling his cold smile. "Heard the news," Vance said. "Heard you finally took a wife. Whole valley's talking of it." He looked past Ethan straight at the porch, straight at Charlotte, and his pale eyes went down her and up her unhurried, and his smile widened. "Well, there she is. My. "You've had your look," Ethan said. "Now state your business or ride off my land." "My business." Vance sighed like a patient man wronged. Ethan, is that any way to greet a neighbor come to offer his congratulations?" He gestured at the 2 men flanking him, hard-faced, quiet, and Charlotte recognized one of them, the big man with the scarred eyebrow from the saloon. Cole Danvers. "I brought a wedding gift, sort of, in a manner of speaking." "I don't want anything of yours." "Now, that's a shame," Vance said, "because I've got something you're going to want to hear about." He leaned on his saddle horn. "It's about your water, Ethan, your creek. The one comes down off the high rock and runs so pretty through your grass and on down to feed half this valley." He smiled. "I've come to buy it. It ain't for sale. Everything's for sale. It's just a question of the number." Vance named one. It was a large number. Charlotte saw the two hired men, Tom and Cole Perry, come up quiet at the edge of the barn, and she saw them hear that number, and she saw their eyes widen, because it was more money than any of them would ever see. Ethan did not so much as blink. "No," he said. Vance's smile flickered just a hair. "You didn't take a breath to think on it." "Don't need to. My daddy took up this ground when nobody wanted it, dug his hands raw, making it pay. He's buried under the pine behind my house and my mother beside him. And this water ran past their graves before you ever came to this country, Vance, and it'll run past 'em after you're gone. It ain't for sale. Not the water, not the grass, not 1 foot of it. Not for your number, nor 10 times your number." Ethan took 1 step closer to the bay horse. "Now I asked you civil to state your business, and you've stated it, and my answer's no. So ride off my land." The two men flanking Vance shifted in their saddles. The big one, Danvers, let his hand drift toward his hip. And Charlotte on the porch reached back through the open door and took the rifle down off the mantel and worked the lever with a sound that carried clean across the still yard, and every man in it heard it, and every man in it looked. "Mr. Vance!" Charlotte called pleasant as pie. The rifle held easy across her body, the way her daddy taught her, muzzle down, but ready. "My husband asked you twice. I don't expect he'll ask a 3rd time. And your man there ought to keep his hand where I can see it, because I don't shoot fancy, but I shoot true, and at this range, I don't need fancy." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Sterling Vance laughed. He laughed out loud, delighted, and he looked at Charlotte on the porch with the rifle, and something in his cold eyes changed. Sharpened, focused, took a new kind of interest. "Well now," he said, "the catalog bride's got teeth." He touched his hat brim to her, mocking courtly. "Ma'am, my compliments. Danvers, take your hand off that pistol before the lady ventilates you." The big man moved his hand. "We'll go," Vance said, gathering his reins. "We'll go, Ethan. No call for anybody to get excited." He turned the bay slow, in no hurry at all. "But I'll say one thing before I do, neighbor to neighbor. You want to think hard on this. You've got no bank behind you, no family behind you. 1 good woman and 2 hired boys and a mountain of grass and a creek half the valley depends on." He smiled his cold smile over his shoulder. "A man in that position, all alone up here, things happen to a man like that. Cattle stray, fences fall, fires start dry summer like this one." He let it hang. "Be a terrible shame if something happened and there was nobody up here to help, and a man lost everything he had and had to sell cheap just to walk away with the shirt on his back. Terrible shame. I'd hate to see it." "Get off my land," Ethan said very low. "Congratulations on the wedding," Vance said. "Truly, she's got more spine than any of us reckoned." And he touched his hat again to Charlotte, and the 3 of them rode down the road at their same unhurried pace, and Charlotte stood on the porch with the rifle until they were out of sight in the timber, and then her arms began to shake so hard she had to set it down. Ethan came up the steps 2 at a time and took her by the shoulders. "You all right?" I'm fine, Ethan, I just—" She let out a breath. "Who is that man?" Ethan's jaw was iron. "Come inside, I'll tell you the whole of it." He looked back at the empty road. "Guess you got a right to know what you married into all of it now." He sat her down, and he sat across from her, and he told it plain. Sterling Vance owned the biggest spread in the county down in the valley, thousands of acres, hundreds of head, a fine house, a hand in the bank, a hand in the town council, a hand in near everything. He'd come to Montana with money already, and made more, and he made it, some of it the honest way, and some of it not. Men who crossed Vance had a way of going broke. Homesteaders who wouldn't sell had a way of getting burned out or finding their cattle scattered, their wells fouled, their fences down until they gave up and sold cheap and moved on, and Vance's land got a little bigger every year. "And my water," Ethan said. "He's wanted a long time. His valley grass dries up hard in a summer like this one. His cattle need water, and his own creeks run low by August, and mine." He nodded toward the sound of the creek. Mine comes off the high snow, runs cold and full all summer every summer. If he had my water rights, he could run twice the cattle. He's tried to buy me out 3 times in 10 years. This is the 4th. And you always said no. I'll always say no. Ethan's hands were fists on the table. That's my folks' ground, Charlotte. That's their graves. I'd sooner die on it than sell it to a man like Vance. He threatened us. You heard him. The fire, the cattle. I heard him. Ethan, he meant it. I know he meant it. Ethan looked at her, and there was fear in his face, but it wasn't fear for himself. That's what's got me by the throat, Charlotte. For 16 years he could threaten me and I didn't much care. I had nothing to lose but a life I'd already made peace with losing. If he'd burned me out, I'd have died fighting the fire, and been glad enough to go. He reached across and took her hand. But now there's you. And that changes it. That changes everything. Now I've got something I ain't willing to lose. And he saw it. You saw how he looked at me when he said it. He saw it. He knows I've got a soft place now where I never had one before. Charlotte's chest went tight. So me being here, me being your wife, that makes you weaker against him? No. Ethan gripped her hand harder. Don't you say that. Don't you ever think that. Being alone all those years didn't make me strong, Charlotte. It just made me not care. There's a difference. A man who don't care about anything ain't strong. He's just already dead and walking. You didn't make me weaker. His voice roughened. You made me alive. And a live man fights harder than a dead one. Remember I said that. She would remember it. She'd have cause to. But that night, lying awake in the dark of the East Room, for they'd kept to their word, slow and proper, though married, now letting the true joining of 2 shy, long, lonely people come in its own time. Charlotte heard Ethan out on the porch, not sleeping either, and she got up and wrapped a shawl round her shoulders and went out to him. He was sitting on the step with the rifle across his knees, looking down the dark road, and he didn't startle when she came, just made room beside him. Can't sleep either, she said. No. She sat. The night was cool and huge and full of stars, and somewhere far off a coyote sang and another answered. Ethan, can he really do it? The fire, the cattle, can he really? He can try. He's tried it on others, and mostly got away with it. Ethan turned the rifle in his hands. But others were homesteaders. One man or a man and a wife, no help, no dogs, half a mile from the next soul. Me, I'm up a mountain 1 road in, and I've got Tom and Cole and the dogs, and I know this ground like my own hand. It won't be easy for him. He knows it won't be easy. That's why he came civil first with a number. He'd rather buy than burn. Burning's a risk. Somebody might see. Somebody might talk. Vance likes his risks small. But if buying doesn't work, then it gets ugly. Yeah. Ethan looked at her in the starlight. I ain't gonna lie to you and say it'll be fine, Charlotte. You're my wife, and I'll tell you true. It might get ugly. But I'll tell you this too. He set the rifle down and took both her hands. You faced down 3 armed men on that porch today, with more sand than most men I know. You worked that lever like you were born to it. Vance came up here expecting to find a soft mountain hermit and a fat woman he could scare. His mouth twisted. He found 2 people who'll fight. He didn't like that. Did you see his face? He didn't like it one bit. It changed his sum for him, and that's on account of you. I was terrified. Sand ain't the absence of fear, Ethan said. It's doing the thing scared. My daddy told me that. He pressed her hands. You've got sand, Charlotte Walker. More than this whole valley reckoned. And come what may, Vance or fire, or the whole world, I'd rather face it beside you than have all the safety in Montana alone. Charlotte leaned her head against his big shoulder, and he stiffened for a moment, unused to it. And then his arm came around her careful, like she might break. And they sat together on the step, under the enormous stars, and neither of them said anything for a long time. Ethan, she said finally. I found a cradle, in the barn loft, under a tarp. She felt him go still. That was my mother's, he said after a while. Carried out from Kentucky. I was rocked in it. Was going to. He stopped. Susanna and I talked of children. After my folks passed and she left, I put it up in the loft and I never. His voice caught. I never looked at it again. You want children, Ethan? He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. I wanted them so bad once it near killed me, he said low. And then I made myself stop wanting anything, 'cause wanting was how a man got destroyed. Wanting my folks to live, they died. Wanting Susanna, she left. Wanting children. He shook his head. So I quit. I quit wanting, and I lived up here 16 years, not wanting a single thing, and I called it peace. His arm tightened around her. And then a stagecoach came up a dusty street, and there was a woman on it hauling her own trunks because a whole town wouldn't help her. And she looked so tired and so brave, and His voice broke clean apart. God help me, Charlotte. I looked at you and I wanted something again for the first time in 16 years. I wanted you off that coach and into my wagon and up this mountain and never gone again. And it scared me half to death, the wanting, because I know what happens when I want. Charlotte turned and put her hand against his weathered face in the dark. Nothing's going to happen to me, she said. You hear? Not to me. I'm not your folks and I'm not Susanna. I don't die easy and I don't leave. I've been left and I've been laughed at and I've been thrown out and I'm still here, still standing, still cooking supper. I'm the hardest thing to get rid of. You ever met Ethan Walker? She pressed her palm to his cheek. You can want me all you please. I'm not going anywhere. Not for Sterling Vance, not for fire, not for the devil himself. And Ethan Walker turned his face into her palm, and Charlotte felt the wet of tears against her hand, and she held the loneliest man in Montana while he wept for everything he'd made himself stop wanting. And then she took his hand and led him inside. And that night, the East Room and the West Room became just their room, and two people who had each been told in their own way that they were not worth loving found out otherwise in the dark, gentle and slow and sure. The trouble started 3 days later. Tom Brennan came riding up to the house at a dead gallop just past dawn, his horse lathered, and Charlotte knew before he'd opened his mouth that it was bad. Boss. Ethan was out the door before Tom had stopped. The upper fence, the drift fence on the north line, it's down. Cut. Not fell. Boss cut clean with nippers 100 yards of it. And the cattle. How many out? Can't tell yet. 50-60. They've scattered up into the rocks and there's cat sign and bear sign all through. We'll lose calves for certain if we don't get up there. Get Cole. Get the dogs. I'll be right behind you. Tom wheeled and galloped for the Hand's cabin, and Ethan turned to Charlotte, already pulling on his coat. Vance. Has to be. Cut the fence in the night and drove 'em up into the high rocks where the predators are. I'm coming with you. No, Charlotte. I can ride and I can push cattle and you need every hand. I need you here. Ethan said, gripping her arms. Listen to me. This is how it's done. You scatter a man's cattle up one side of his place, and while he's chasing them, he looked at the house, at the barn. While he's up in the rocks all day with every hand he's got, the fire starts down here, where there's nobody left to fight it. His eyes were hard. It's the old trick and a mean one. Draw the men off, then burn the buildings. He's counting on all of us going up after the stock. Charlotte went cold. Then don't go. Let the cattle go. I let 60 head die to bear and cat we don't make it through winter, and then Vance wins anyhow, just slower. Ethan shook his head. No. I gotta save the cattle. But not everybody goes. I'll send Cole up with Tom. They can work the rocks, 2 men and dogs. I'll stay close. I'll work the near draws and keep the buildings in sight. He took her face in his hands. And you stay in this house, doors barred, rifle loaded, and you watch. Anybody comes up that road, anybody at all, you fire 2 shots in the air. 2 shots. I'll hear it and I'll come. You understand? 2 shots. 2 shots. And Charlotte? He kissed her hard and quick. If it comes to it, if a man means you harm and won't stop you, don't fire in the air. You understand me. You do what your daddy taught you, and you don't think twice, and you don't feel bad about it after. You're worth 10 of any man Vance would send. 10. Don't you dare let one of them take you from me." "Go save your cattle," Charlotte said, though her heart was in her throat. "I'll mind the house. Go." He went. He caught Smoke and threw a saddle on, and was gone up the mountain with the dogs, and Charlotte barred the doors, and loaded the rifle, and set it by the window, and settled in to watch the long, long day. Nothing came all morning. She watched the road till her eyes ached. She kept the fire low, so a watcher wouldn't see much smoke. She heard far up the mountain the faint sound of the dogs, and once a shot, a wolf or a cat, she hoped, and not a man. The sun climbed and blazed, and the dry grass whispered in the hot wind, and Charlotte watched and waited, and the waiting was worse than any work. It was past noon when she smelled it. Smoke. But not chimney smoke, not wood smoke. The sharp, green, choking smell of grass fire. And it wasn't coming from the mountain. It was coming from behind the house, from the west, from upwind. Charlotte ran to the back window, and there it was, a line of orange low in the dry grass at the edge of the west pasture, maybe 200 yards off, and the hot wind driving it straight at the buildings at the barn at the house, and no man in sight who'd set it. They'd set it and slipped off already, and there was no one to fight it but her. She did not fire 2 shots in the air. There was no time, and Ethan was up the mountain a mile and more, and by the time he came the barn would be gone. The barn with the horses in it, the horses she'd learned to love, and Smoke was up the mountain, but the teams were in that barn, and the house, their house, the house she'd made into a home. Charlotte Walker did not panic. She had cooked over open flame her whole life, and she knew fire knew it was a live thing, and how it moved and what it wanted, and she thought fast and clear. It wants the grass. It wants a path of dry grass to the buildings. Take away the path. There was a fire break already, the trampled dirt of the yard, the garden she'd turned to bare soil, the wagon road. But the west pasture grass ran right up close on that side, close enough for the fire to jump. She needed a wider break, and she needed it now, and there was one way to make one fast, that her daddy had taught her a way that was dangerous and desperate, and worked. You fight fire with fire. She grabbed a shovel and a wet sack, and ran to the strip of grass between the oncoming line and the barn, and she set a small, careful backfire in the dead grass just at the edge of the bare yard, and she beat and shoveled, and drove it toward the coming fire, burning a black bare strip, so that when the big fire arrived, it would find nothing left to eat. It was mad work, terrible work, choking and blind in the smoke, her lungs burning her hands, blistering on the shovel, sparks landing in her hair, her good sense screaming that she was a lone woman setting fire in the path of fire. But she'd done it as a girl on the Ohio flats beside her father, and she did it now, and the black strip widened, and the roar of the big fire grew, and the heat became a wall. And then 2 horses came pounding down out of the timber at a killing gallop, and it was Ethan, and behind him a rider she didn't know. And Ethan came off Smoke before the horse had stopped screaming her name. "Charlotte! Here! The brake! Hold the brake!" She couldn't spare breath for more, and Ethan Walker saw in one glance what she'd done, saw the black strip she'd burned across the fire's path, saw his wife black with soot and half-choked, driving a backfire like a seasoned hand. And he didn't waste a second. He grabbed a wet sack and threw himself in beside her, and the stranger too. And the 3 of them beat and shoveled and held that line while the big fire came down on them, roaring like a train, and hit the black strip Charlotte had burned and found nothing to eat. It guttered, it clawed along the edges hunting for grass and found char and bare dirt, and it fell back on itself, and it died there in a long line 20 feet from the barn wall, and the horses inside screamed and kicked. But the barn stood. The house stood, everything stood black-edged and smoking, but whole. Charlotte sat down hard in the burned dirt because her legs wouldn't hold her. Ethan was on his knees beside her, instantly, his hands on her face, on her arms, frantic. "You're burned your hands, Charlotte, your hands." "I'm all right." She could barely talk for the smoke. "Blisters, it's nothing. The barn's fine. You saved the barn. You saved everything." He pulled her against him, filthy and shaking, and held her so tight it hurt. "You crazy, brave, impossible woman, you fought a grass fire alone. Somebody had to—" She rasped, and then she started coughing and couldn't stop, and Ethan held her through it, rocking her, saying her name over and over like a prayer. It was the stranger who finally spoke. He'd been beating out the last of the sparks, and now he straightened a young man, dark-haired, dusty, with a tin star pinned to his vest that Charlotte hadn't seen through the smoke. "Ma'am," he said hoarse. "In 12 years wearing this badge, I never saw anybody, man nor woman, do what you just did." He looked at the dead fire, the black line, the standing barn. "You backfired it, alone. You know most folks who try that burn their own place down and themselves with it." "My daddy taught me," Charlotte managed. "Your daddy," the young man said, "was a smart man." He put out a soot-blacked hand. "Deputy Marshal Jesse Crane, ma'am, Territorial. I was riding up to see Mr. Walker on another matter entire when I saw the smoke." He looked at Ethan. "And I reckon Mr. Walker, that other matter, and this fire are going to turn out to be the same matter. Because I didn't ride all this way up your mountain to pass the time. I rode up here because somebody's been to see the Territorial Marshal about Sterling Vance. And I've got some questions about a burned-out homestead down in the Two Rivers country that's going to interest you a great deal." Ethan went still, his arms still around his soot-black wife. "Say that again," he said. "There's a case building against Vance," the deputy said. "A real one, federal, for land fraud and arson and worse going back years. But it's been building slow because every man he ever burned out was too scared or too broke or too gone to testify. We've never had a witness who'd stand up, never had one with proof, and never had one who wouldn't run." He looked down at Charlotte sitting in the ashes of the fire she'd beaten with her own two blistered hands. "And then I ride up a mountain and find a woman who just stood in front of a fire Sterling Vance set and fought it and won." His jaw tightened. "Ma'am, Mr. Walker, I think you two might just be the thing this whole valley's been waiting 16 years for. But I got to ask you straight, and you got to answer me straight, because everything's going to turn on it." He crouched down in front of them, level with Charlotte's exhausted, soot-streaked, unbroken face. "When Sterling Vance rode up here 3 days ago and threatened this place, and I'd bet my badge he did, was there anybody with you who heard him say it? Anybody at all who'd stand up in a federal court and put a hand on a Bible and swear to the words that came out of that man's mouth?" And Charlotte Walker lifted her chin, the way she'd lifted it, stepping off the coach into a jeering town, and she looked the deputy marshal dead in the eye, and through cracked and smoke-burned lips she said, "There were 4 of us, me and my husband and both his hired men. We all heard every word, and I'll swear to it in any court in this country, with my hand on any Bible you like." She got her feet under her, and she stood up out of the ashes, swaying, but upright, and Ethan rose with her, holding her steady. "That man rode up my mountain and threatened my home and my husband, and today he tried to burn us out. And if you've been waiting 16 years for somebody who won't run from Sterling Vance—" She spat black soot into the dead fire. "Then, deputy, your waiting's over, because I have never once in my life run from a bully, and I don't aim to start with him." Deputy Jesse Crane looked at her a long moment. Then he stood, and he took off his hat, the second man in a month to take off his hat to the woman a whole town wouldn't give water to, and he said, quiet and certain, "Mrs. Walker, I believe you might be about to change this whole country." He settled his hat back on. "But I'll tell you now, so you go in with your eyes open. If you stand up against Sterling Vance, if you truly stand up, then everything that's happened so far, the fence and the fire and the ugly words, all of it." He looked down the mountain toward the valley, toward the big house where a cold-eyed man sat waiting to hear whether the mountain had burned. All of it was just him being polite. All of it was just him being polite, the deputy had said, and Charlotte thought of those words all through the next week, because they turned out to be truer than she'd wanted them to be. Jesse Crane stayed 2 nights on the mountain. He took down every word of it, careful, in a leather book, the fence cut with nippers, the cattle driven into the rocks, the fire set upwind of the buildings, while the men were drawn off the exact threat Sterling Vance had spoken in the yard. He had Ethan sign it, and Tom and Cole Perry, and last of all Charlotte. And when she'd signed her name in her plain, firm hand, he looked at the page a long moment. 4 sworn witnesses, he said. To a threat and to arson. That's more than I've ever had against that man in one place. He closed the book. But I got to be honest with you folks, and honesty's the only coin I deal in. A threat's a hard thing to hang a man on. He said cattle stray and fences fall. He never said I'll cut your fence and burn your grass. A slick lawyer in Vance can buy the slickest in the territory, turns that into a neighbor giving friendly warning about a dry summer. He tapped the book. And the fire. Nobody saw a hand strike a match. We know he did it. Knowing and proving are 2 different mountains. Then what good is any of it? Ethan asked. It's a start. It's a foundation. Crane looked at them steady. What I need to sink Sterling Vance for good ain't a threat, and it ain't a grass fire. It's the land. It's the paper. Because a man like Vance don't take a place by burning it. The burning's just to make you quit. The taking is done with paper. Deeds, water filings, foreclosures. And somewhere in the county records and the bank's books, there is a paper trail of every homestead he ever squeezed out, every water right he ever stole, every foreclosure he ever rigged with a banker in his pocket. He leaned forward. That paper trail is the rope that hangs him. And I mean to find it, but it'll take time and it'll take proof, and while I'm building it, he looked out toward the valley. You folks are in the worst danger of your lives, because Vance is going to hear a marshal's been up your mountain, and he's going to know you talked, and the polite part is over. He rode down at dawn on the 3rd day, and he took the sworn statements with him, and he told them to trust no one from the valley, to keep the dogs close and the guns loaded, and to send Tom riding for the marshal's office the moment anything happened. And Mrs. Walker. He'd paused mounted at the top of the road. That paper trail I need. It runs through the bank in Red Hollow, and through the county clerk's office, and through the records of every family Vance ever ruined. Most of those families are scattered to the wind. But some of the women, the wives, the widows, some of them are still around this country working as cooks, as washwomen, as help in other men's houses. He'd looked down at her, at the woman who'd been a cook her whole life, who'd been thrown out of fine kitchens for how she looked. Women talk to women, ma'am. They talk to women who've been treated hard because a woman who's been treated hard don't judge. You might hear things a marshal never could. You keep your ears open. You just might. And then he was gone, and the waiting began again, and the waiting was the worst of it. For 9 days, nothing. 9 days of Ethan riding his fence lines twice over, of the dogs, sleeping on the porch of the rifle, never more than an arm's reach from either of them. Charlotte kept the house and worked the garden and put up the first of the summer squash, and she watched Ethan wind tighter and tighter, a man braced for a blow that wouldn't fall, and she knew that was the cruelty of it, that Vance would make them wait, would let the waiting do his work, would let 2 people jump at shadows until their nerves wore through. On the 10th day, Ethan said they were out of coffee and flour, and a dozen things besides, and there was no help for it. They had to go to town. Both of us, Charlotte said. I'm not staying up here alone, and I'm not letting you go down there alone. Charlotte, the town. The town can look at me all it likes. I've been looked at before. She was already reaching for her bonnet. And besides, you heard the deputy. Women talk to women. I'm not going to hear a single useful thing sitting up a mountain. If there's things to learn, they're down there in that town in the kitchens and the wash yards. She tied the bonnet under her chin. I'm coming. And that's the end of it. So they drove down together, the 2 of them, on the wagon seat into Red Hollow on a hot, bright Saturday when the town was full. And the town went quiet when they saw her. But it was not the same quiet as before. Word had gone up and down the valley in 3 weeks. Word of the woman who'd faced down Sterling Vance's men on a porch with a rifle. Word of the fire she'd beaten alone. Word of a marshal riding up the mountain. Charlotte Walker was no longer just the fat catalog bride they'd laughed at. She was something the town didn't have a name for yet, and didn't know what to do with, and so they went quiet, and they watched. Ethan helped her down from the wagon, took her hand, and she took his in front of the whole main street, and stood beside him, and they walked into Amos Hargrove's general store together. Amos, the storekeeper, looked up. And Charlotte watched him remember. Remember the day he'd stood by a full water barrel and let her ask and not moved. "Walker," Amos said carefully. "Mrs. Walker." "Amos," Ethan said. "We need supplies. Lists here." Amos took the list. He read it, and then he set it down on the counter, and he was quiet a moment, and Charlotte saw a man wrestling with something. "Mrs. Walker," he said finally, "I owe you an apology." Charlotte said nothing. She'd learned long ago that when a body was working up to an apology, the kindest and the shrewdest thing was to let them do it without help. "The day you come in," Amos went on, not meeting her eyes, "you asked for water, and I stood right there by the barrel, and I didn't move because—" His jaw worked. "Because the whole town was watching, and I hadn't the sand to be the one who broke from it. I let a tired woman go thirsty because I was afraid of what my neighbors would think if I was kind to her." He looked up now, and his face was red. "That's a low thing. That's about the lowest thing I ever did, and I've thought on it every day since Walker shamed us all with that dipper. So I'm saying it plain. I'm sorry, ma'am. It was wrong, and I knew it was wrong while I was doing it, and I'm ashamed." The store was silent. 2 other customers had gone, still listening. Charlotte looked at Amos Hargrove a long moment, and then she did the thing that was hardest and best, the thing that was the whole of who she was. "Amos," she said gently, "I forgive you." The storekeeper's eyes went bright, and he looked away quick. "I mean it," Charlotte said. "I don't hold it. A body does a hard thing in a crowd that they'd never do alone. I know that better than most, being on the wrong end of crowds my whole life. You've said you're sorry, and you've meant it, and that's more than most folks manage, and it's done. Now." She smiled at him, warm, real. "You fill that order and you throw in a sack of good coffee on the house to call it square, and we'll be friends from here on. And I'll bring you down eggs and butter every Saturday, because a store ought to sell the best, and my eggs are the best in this county. What do you say?" Amos Hargrove laughed a short, wet, surprised laugh, and he stuck out his hand, and Charlotte shook it. "Deal," he said. "And the coffee's on me, and so's the sugar, and God bless you, ma'am, you're a better Christian than the whole rest of this town put together, myself included." And that was the moment, Charlotte would think later, that was the moment the tide first turned. Not with a rifle or a fire, but with a woman forgiving a small man for a small cruelty in front of witnesses, and meaning it. Because the 2 customers listening carried it out of the store, and it went up and down the street faster than any mean word ever had. She forgave him. Amos said his sorry, and she forgave him. Gentle as you please. The fat woman from the mountain. She forgave him. While Amos filled the order, Charlotte stepped out onto the boardwalk, and she saw across the street a woman. An older woman, gray-haired thin, in a washed-out dress, carrying a heavy basket of laundry toward the hotel. A working woman. A woman with the particular bowed shoulders of one who'd been broken by something and kept going anyway. And she was looking at Charlotte not with the town's curiosity, but with something else. Something like recognition. Charlotte crossed the street to her. "Let me take one end of that," she said, reaching for the basket. "It's too heavy for one, and it's too hot a day to be proud about it." The woman blinked at her. "Ma'am, you don't need to." "I know I don't. Take the other end." And Charlotte lifted, and the woman lifted, and together they carried the basket into the shade by the hotel washyard and set it down, and the woman straightened and looked at Charlotte with an expression Charlotte couldn't read. "You're her," the woman said. "The one married Walker, the one they all—" She stopped. "The one they all laughed at, yes." Charlotte smiled. "Charlotte Walker, and you are— Ruth?" The woman's voice was low. "Ruth Ackerley." And then something crossed her face, some old pain surfacing, and she looked around quick to see who might be near. And there was no one. And she looked back at Charlotte and she said very quiet, "You had trouble with Vance. That's the talk, that he tried to burn you out." Charlotte went still. "Where'd you hear that?" "Everywhere, nowhere. It's the kind of thing gets whispered." Ruth's hands twisted in her apron. "I heard he came up your mountain and threatened you, and set your grass afire, and you fought it off, and a marshal came." Her eyes were wet, now wet and fierce. "Is it true?" "It's true," Charlotte said quietly. "Every word." And Ruth Ackerley made a sound in her throat, like something breaking loose after years, and she gripped Charlotte's arm with a thin, hard hand, and she said in a rush of whisper, "He burned us too, 9 years ago. 2 Rivers country. Me and my Samuel and our 3 boys. Vance wanted our bottom land. We had the only good crossing on that stretch of river, and Samuel wouldn't sell, and one night our barn went up, and then the next month the hay, and then somebody shot our milk cow dead in the field, and Samuel—" Her voice cracked. "Samuel wouldn't quit either. Stubborn. Like your husband. And one night he rode out to check the far fence after we'd had more trouble, and he never came home, and they found him 3 days later at the bottom of the river gorge, and the sheriff, Vance's sheriff back then, said his horse must have spooked and thrown him." Ruth's face twisted. "Samuel Ackerley could ride anything on 4 legs from the time he was 6 years old. That horse didn't throw him. Somebody put him in that gorge. And I've known it 9 years, and never had a soul to tell it to who'd believe me or do a thing about it, because who listens to a widow washing hotel sheets? Who listens to me?" Charlotte's blood had gone to ice. "I listen," she said. "Ruth, look at me. I listen. And I know a man, a marshal, a real one, a good one, who's been waiting 9 years to hear exactly what you just told me. And he will believe you. And he will do something about it." She took both the woman's thin hands in her scarred ones. "You're not alone anymore. You hear me? You are not alone anymore." And Ruth Ackerley, who had carried a murdered husband and a stolen home in silence for 9 years because the world had decided a poor washwoman's grief didn't signify, put her face in her hands and wept right there in the wash yard. And Charlotte held her, and over the woman's shaking shoulder, Charlotte's eyes had gone hard as flint, because now it wasn't just her mountain and her husband anymore. Now it was murder. They didn't speak more there. Too many ears, too much risk. But Charlotte got Ruth's word to come up the mountain the following week. Quiet told anyone who asked that she was bringing eggs and mending, and they'd talk safe where no one of Vance's could hear. And when Charlotte climbed back onto the wagon beside Ethan, her face was so changed that he knew at once something had happened. "What is it?" "Not here," she said. "Drive." She told him on the road out of earshot of the town, and she watched his face go from confusion to horror to a cold and terrible anger. "Murder," Ethan said. "You're telling me he killed a man. I'm telling you what she told me. And I believe her, Ethan. I've heard a lot of lies in my life and a lot of truth, and I know the sound of the difference. That woman wasn't lying. Her husband was murdered and her home was stolen, and she's carried it alone for 9 years." Charlotte's jaw was set. And she can't have been the only one. The deputy said there were others. Families scattered to the wind. But some are still here, still working in this county, still carrying what she carried. And if we can find them, if we can get them to talk— "You want to gather them?" Ethan said slowly. "The people Vance ruined. You want to find them, and gather them, and get them to stand up together. One washwoman's word, Vance's lawyer tears apart," Charlotte said. "A grieving widow, they'll say. Bitter. Imagining things. But 10 of them, 10 families all telling the same story, of the same man, burning the same way, buying the same cheap, and every one of them with a piece of paper, a foreclosure, notice, a forced deed, a water filing that don't add up." Her eyes blazed. "You can't tear apart 20. You can't call 20 people bitter and imagining. 20 is a fire nobody can backfire, Ethan. 20 burns the whole thing down." Ethan looked at his wife on the wagon seat. Soot-scarred hands, plain blue dress, a woman a whole town had thought too big and too low to matter, and there was something like awe on his face. "You'd do that," he said. "You'd take that on. After everything. The town that laughed at you, the man that tried to burn you, you'd stand up in the middle of all of it and gather an army." "They're not an army," Charlotte said quietly. "They're just people who got hurt and got told their hurt didn't count. I know exactly how that feels, Ethan. I've felt it my whole life, being told you don't count." She looked out at the mountains. "And I found out it's a lie. My hurt counts. Ruth's hurt counts. Every one of theirs counts. And I aim to make Sterling Vance and this whole valley learn it does. They came for Ruth first, quiet the next week. And Ruth brought a paper she'd kept 9 years hidden in a Bible, the foreclosure notice on the Ackerley place, signed by a bank officer named Harmon. Dated 3 weeks after Samuel died on a loan, Ruth swore to God her husband had never taken. He didn't borrow that money, Ruth said, spreading the yellowed paper on Charlotte's clean table with shaking hands. Samuel never borrowed $1 in his life. He'd sooner die than owe. But there's his name, signed. And I never signed a thing, but the bank said the loan was called, and the place went to auction, and Vance bought it for a song, and there weren't a thing I could do. She looked up. It's forged. Samuel's signature. I know his hand, and that ain't it. But who'd take a widow's word over a bank's paper? Ethan bent over the document, and Charlotte watched his face change. Ruth, he said slowly. This bank officer, Harmon, is he still at the Red Hollow Bank? He is, Vance's man through and through. Because I know this signature business, Ethan said. My daddy dealt with that bank for 30 years. And there's a old teller there name of Pettigrew been there longer than anybody honest as the day kept out of Vance's pocket somehow too small to bother with. If anybody knows how those loans were papered, how the signatures were done. He looked up at Charlotte. It'd be Pettigrew, but he'd never talk. Scared of losing his place. Old man, no family, that job's all he's got. Old man, Charlotte said thoughtfully. No family. Eats alone, I'd wager. Ethan looked at her. Every man eats, Charlotte said. And a lonely old man who eats alone, who nobody's cooked a kind meal for in years. A slow, sad smile. I know something about reaching a person like that, Ethan. I married one. That week Charlotte began going down to Red Hollow every Saturday regular, with her eggs and her butter and her forgiveness, and the town that had laughed at her began one soul at a time to soften toward her, because she remembered everyone's name and asked after everyone's ailments and pressed a spare loaf on a hungry-looking child and forgave over and over the small cruelties they'd shown her until it became a kind of shame in the town to have been unkind to Charlotte Walker, and a kind of quiet pride to have her nod at you on the street. And every Saturday she found her way easy and natural into a conversation with old Pettigrew, the teller who took his dinner alone at the hotel every noon, and who one day found a slice of dried apple pie set down beside his coffee compliments of the lady from the mountain who'd made too much and hated to see it go to waste. And the next Saturday, another. And the woman who brought it never asked him a single thing about the bank, only sat and talked to him kind about nothing, about the weather and his rheumatism and the old days when his wife was living. God rest her, and the old man began to watch for Saturdays the way a plant watches for the sun. It was slow work, it was patient work, and all the while up on the mountain the danger tightened. Vance's cattle began to appear on Ethan's low range, strayed, his riders said with flat, hard smiles when Ethan drove them off. A steer of Ethan's turned up dead by the creek throat, cut left where he'd finded a message. One night, the dogs went wild at something in the dark, and Ethan fired into the timber and heard a horse crash away and found boot prints in the morning not 40 yards from the house. Vance was circling closer and closer, letting them feel the noose. And Ethan hardly slept, and Charlotte watched him fray, and she made him a promise one night as they lay listening to the dogs. We're close, she whispered. Pettigrew's near to trusting me. One more Saturday, too. He'll talk. I feel it. And when he does, we take it all to Crane Ruth's paper and Pettigrew's word and the others, and it's over. We just have to hold on a little longer. I'm not afraid for me, Ethan said, staring at the dark ceiling. You know that. I stopped being afraid for myself a long time ago. He turned to her. I'm afraid for you. Every Saturday you drive down into that town, into reach of his men, and I let you go because you're right, because it's the only way, and every Saturday I don't breathe right till I see the wagon come back up that road. His hand found hers. If anything happened to you, Charlotte, nothing's going to... You don't know that, his voice broke. He killed a man, Charlotte. Ruth Samuel. He put a man in a gorge for a river crossing. What do you think he'll do to a woman who's gathering his victims against him? What do you think he'll do when he finds out, and he will find out that the fat catalog bride he laughed at is building the case that hangs him? He gripped her hand hard. Promise me. Promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you won't take a chance you don't have to take. I promise, Charlotte said, and she meant it. But some chances a body doesn't choose. Some chances come and find you. It was the second Saturday of August, blazing hot, and Charlotte had driven down. Alone, Ethan laid up with a horse-kicked knee, furious about it, made her swear to be back by 3. She'd sold her eggs and forgiven her weekly quota of the newly penitent, and she'd sat with old Pettigrew over his pie. And this Saturday, she'd felt the old man on the edge of it, felt him wanting to say a thing, watched him start and stop 3 times, and finally she'd said soft, Mr. Pettigrew, whatever it is you're carrying, you can set it down with me. I'm the safest person in this county to set a hard thing down with. Ask anybody. I carry other folks' hard things, and I never once dropped one. And the old man had looked at her with his rheumy eyes, and opened his mouth, and a shadow fell across the table. Well, said Sterling Vance, isn't this cozy? He stood over them in his fine gray suit, hat in hand, smiling his cold smile, and behind him stood Cole Danvers, with his scarred eyebrow and his hand near his hip, and the hotel dining room had gone dead silent, everyone watching. Old Pettigrew shrank in his chair like a dry leaf. Mrs. Walker, Vance said, warm as poison. You do get around. Eggs on Saturday, is it? And pie for my teller here. He set his hat on the table and pulled out a chair and sat uninvited, easy master of the room. Sit still. Pettigrew, don't scurry off. We're all friends. Aren't we, Mrs. Walker? All neighbors together. Mr. Vance, Charlotte said. Her heart was slamming, but her voice was steady as stone. I don't recall inviting you to sit. No, you didn't. Vance's smile didn't waver. But I find I don't much wait for invitations. Never have. It's how a man gets ahead in this country. He leaned back. I've been hearing things about you, Mrs. Walker. Curious things. They say you've gone real friendly with folks lately. The washwoman Ackerley, old Pettigrew here, others besides. They say you drive down every Saturday, and you sit, and you talk, and you listen. His pale eyes narrowed, and the warmth dropped clean out of his voice, and what was left was cold enough to freeze the blood. I do wonder what a mountain rancher's wife finds so fascinating in the talk of washwomen and bank tellers. I surely do wonder. Charlotte looked back at him and did not blink. I find people fascinating, Mr. Vance, she said. All kinds. I like to hear their stories. I've had a hard life, and hard-lived folks feel easy with me because I don't judge. You'd be surprised what people tell a woman who doesn't judge them. She let that sit and watched something flicker in his eyes. Why the things I've heard just this summer. It'd curl your hair. It was a dangerous thing to say, and she knew it as she said it. But she'd learned long ago that a bully feeds on your fear and starves when you show none, and she would not give this man one crumb of fear to feed on. Vance's smile came back, but it was different now, thinner, and there was something behind it that hadn't been there before. Wariness. She'd rattled him. Just a little. Just enough. You're a bold woman, he said softly. I'll grant you that. Bolder than's good for you. He picked up his hat and turned it in his hands. Let me tell you a story, Mrs. Walker, since you like stories so well. There was a family once down in the Two Rivers country. Stubborn people. Wouldn't listen to good sense. And do you know? His eyes were fixed on hers now, and there was murder in them, plain unhidden, meant for her to see. Do you know that whole family came to grief? Every one. Fire and loss. And finally the husband, poor fellow, took a fall from his horse one dark night and drowned in the river. Terrible thing. Terrible. He smiled. The country's a dangerous place, Mrs. Walker, for folks who don't know when to leave well enough alone. Accidents happen. To husbands. And I'd imagine, his voice dropped, to wives. The threat hung in the silent room naked, and every soul there heard it. And Charlotte Walker, who had been laughed at and thrown out, and refused water, who had faced down 3 armed men and fought a fire alone, leaned forward across the table and looked Sterling Vance dead in his cold, pale eyes, and said in a voice quiet enough that only he and Pettigrew could hear it, "You just told me you killed Samuel Ackerley." Vance went very still. "You didn't mean to," Charlotte said softly. "But you did. You couldn't help it. Bullies never can. You had to let me know, had to see me be afraid. But I'm not afraid, Mr. Vance. And now I know. I know from your own mouth." She smiled at him, gentle and terrible. "And there's a room full of witnesses just saw you threaten my life. So you go on and have your accidents happen to me if you dare. But you best make it a good one. Because if one hair on my head so much as bends wrong, there is a territorial marshal named Jesse Crane, who already has 4 sworn statements against you locked in his office, and a widow's forged foreclosure, and more coming every week, and my death won't scare a one of us into quitting. It'll be the thing that hangs you. My funeral will be your gallows, Mr. Vance. So think real hard about whether killing me is worth the rope." For a long, long moment, Sterling Vance said nothing. Then he stood, slow, and he set his hat on his head, and he looked down at her, and for the first time, the smile was entirely gone, and what was underneath it was uglier and more frightened than she'd hoped to see. "You've made a mistake," he said low. "You should have run when you had the chance." "I don't run," Charlotte said. "You should have learned that by now." Vance turned to go, and old Pettigrew forgotten. Shrinking in his chair, old Pettigrew watched the most powerful man in the county threaten to murder the only person who'd shown him kindness in a decade, watched him do it bold and unafraid, certain no one would ever stand against him, and something in the old teller broke. "He forges them." The words came out of Pettigrew cracked and quavering, but they carried across the whole silent dining room, and Sterling Vance stopped dead. The loans. Pettigrew was on his feet now, shaking all over, 40 years of fear pouring out of him in a rush he couldn't stop. The foreclosures. Harmon forges the signatures, and Vance buys the places at auction, and I've watched it for 9 years. I've filed the papers with my own hands. God forgive me. I've known, and I've kept still because I was afraid I was a coward. I let it happen. The Ackerleys, the Combses, the Duncan place, the Reyes family, all of them, all forged, all stolen. He was weeping now, the old man weeping and pointing a shaking finger at Vance. "And you killed Samuel Ackerley. I always knew you killed him, and I kept still. But I won't keep still no more. This woman brought me pie. This woman listened to me. First kindness I've had since my Martha died, and you'd murder her for it in a hotel dining room in front of God and everybody." His old voice cracked to pieces. No, I'm done. I'll tell it all. I'll tell the marshal every name and every date and every forgery, and I'll swear to it. And you can't hurt me. I'm old and I'm alone, and I don't care anymore what you do to me. But I won't die having kept your secrets. I won't. The dining room erupted. Sterling Vance's face had gone white as bone. He looked at the old teller who'd just condemned him, and at the ring of townsfolk who'd heard every word, and at Charlotte Walker sitting calm in the middle of it all. And he understood she watched him. Understand that it had gotten away from him. That in his need to frighten one woman he'd threatened murder in front of 40 witnesses and cracked open a coward who'd been holding his secrets for 9 years, and now it was loose, all of it, loose in the open air where he couldn't burn it or bury it or buy it back. "Danvers," Vance said hoarsely. "Danvers, the old man's raving, he's—" But Cole. Danvers was looking at the room full of witnesses, and Cole Danvers was a hired hard case, not a fool. And Charlotte saw the calculation run behind his scarred face, saw him weigh his loyalty to Vance against 40 people who'd just heard a murder confessed, and saw him take one step back from his boss. And that step was the end of Sterling Vance's kingdom, though it would take a reckoning yet to finish it. "Somebody ride for the marshal," Charlotte said into the uproar, and her voice cut through it clean and calm and certain. "Somebody ride for Jesse Crane right now and tell him to come to Red Hollow, and tell him to bring every deputy he's got." She stood up from the table and she put her arm around old Pettigrew's shaking shoulders, and she held the trembling, brave old man against her side, and she looked at Sterling Vance across the ruin of everything he'd built on lies. "It's over, Mr. Vance," she said quietly. "You wanted to know what a rancher's wife found so fascinating in the talk of washwomen and tellers. Well, now you know. She was building the rope. And you just now, with your own mouth in front of this whole town, you tied the knot yourself. You just now, with your own mouth in front of this whole town, you tied the knot yourself," Charlotte had said, and Sterling Vance did not stay to hear another word of it. He moved fast for a man his age. He turned and shoved through the crowded dining room, upsetting a chair. And Cole Danvers hesitated 1/2 second more, and then went after him. And by the time the townsfolk had gathered their wits enough to react, the two of them were out the door and mounting up. And Charlotte heard the horses tear off down the main street at a gallop. "He's running," somebody shouted. "Vance is running." "Let him run," Charlotte said, still holding old Pettigrew steady against her side. "A running man's already halfway to hanged. Where's he going to go? He can't outrun his own bank records. He can't outrun what this whole room just heard." She raised her voice over the din. "Now who's the fastest rider here? Because somebody needs to get to Marshall Crane before Vance does something worse than run." A young man pushed forward, one of the livery hands, no more than 17, but Charlotte had traded kind words with him on her Saturdays, and he'd have walked through fire for her now. "I'll go, Mrs. Walker. I got the fastest horse in town, the roan. I can be at the Marshall station in under 2 hours. Then go. Tell Jesse Crane exactly what happened here. Every word Vance said. Every word Mr. Pettigrew said. Tell him Pettigrew will swear to forgery going back 9 years and to knowing about Samuel Ackerley's murder, and tell him Vance has run and to come quick and come armed." She caught the boy's sleeve. "And ride careful. If you see Vance's men on the road, you go around. You don't stop for anybody. You hear me?" "Yes, ma'am." And the boy was gone. Charlotte turned back to the room, and 40 faces looked at her. The same faces that had laughed at her off a stagecoach 2 months before, that had let her go thirsty, that had called her too big for the frontier. And now they looked at her like she was the only solid thing in a world that had just cracked open, and they waited for her to tell them what to do. She almost laughed at that. The catalog bride giving orders to Red Hollow. "Mr. Pettigrew," she said gently to the old man still trembling under her arm, "you did the bravest thing I ever saw a body do. And now you're in danger, worse danger than any of us, because you're the one who can hang him. So you're not going home tonight, and you're not staying anywhere Vance knows to look." She looked up. "Amos, can he stay with you behind the store where a body could bar a door and keep a gun handy?" "He can," said Amos Hargrove, stepping forward. And there was iron in the storekeeper. Now that hadn't been there before a man who'd found his sand late, but found it good. "And I'll sit up with him, and my rifle's a good one, and any man of Vance's comes to my back door tonight'll wish he hadn't." He put a hand on Pettigrew's shoulder. "Come on, Ned, you'll be safe with me, and," his voice thickened, "and I'm proud to know you. 40 years, you sat quiet in that bank, and today you stood up taller than any of us. Come on now." They took the old man away, careful, and the room began to break apart into knots of frightened, excited, buzzing people, and Charlotte knew she had one thing left to do that could not wait, and it was the thing that frightened her most. She had to get up the mountain to Ethan, because Vance was running, and a cornered man does not run home. A cornered man strikes at the thing that cornered him. And the thing that had cornered Sterling Vance was her and her husband, up a mountain, laid up with a kicked knee alone, but for 2 hired hands and a pack of dogs, not knowing that the whole world had just come apart in a hotel dining room, not knowing his wife had just made herself the most dangerous person in the territory to a murderer with nothing left to lose. She climbed onto her wagon, and she whipped the team harder than she'd ever whipped a horse in her life. The road up the mountain had never seemed so long. She pushed the team till they lathered, and her hands ached on the reins, and the whole 2 hours she prayed to a God she wasn't sure was listening, but prayed anyway. Let him be all right. Let me be wrong. Let Vance run east and keep running. Don't let him go up my mountain. Please, please, not Ethan. You can take anything else but not Ethan. And when she came around the last bend and the ranch opened up before her, she saw the smoke. Not chimney smoke. The barn was burning. "No," Charlotte said. "No, no, no." And she whipped the team down the last stretch, screaming Ethan's name, and as she came into the yard, she saw it all in one terrible glance. The barn wall aflame, Tom Brennan beating at it with a wet blanket, Cole Perry hauling water, the horses screaming inside, and Ethan limping badly on his hurt knee, dragging a horse out of the burning barn by its halter. His shirt scorched his face, black, and 3 riders at the far edge of the yard, and one of them lifting a rifle. "Ethan!" Charlotte screamed. "Down, get down!" He turned at her voice, and the rifle cracked, and Ethan spun and went down hard in the dirt, and Charlotte's whole world stopped. She did not remember getting off the wagon. She did not remember snatching up the rifle from under the seat. She only knew that she was running across the yard toward her fallen husband, and that the riders were coming, and that she planted her feet and threw the rifle to her shoulder, and fired. Not in the air. Not this time. She fired at the man who'd shot Ethan, and she saw his horse rear, and the man clutch his arm and drop his own rifle. And she worked the lever and fired again, and the 3 riders scattered, not expecting it, not expecting a woman standing over a downed man to shoot back and shoot true. "Charlotte!" It was Ethan's voice. Ethan's voice. Thank God. Thank God. And she risked one glance, and saw him pushing himself up on one elbow, blood dark on his shoulder, but alive, cursing, and reaching for the pistol at his own hip. "Charlotte, get behind the well, the stone well." She backed toward him. Instead, rifle up, covering him, and the riders wheeled at the yard's edge, and Charlotte got her first clear look, and her stomach turned to ice. It was Vance himself. Sterling Vance on his blood bay horse, his fine gray suit gone in range clothes, now a rifle across his saddle, and murder on his white face. And beside him, Cole Danvers and one other hard case, the one Charlotte had winged clutching a bleeding arm. 3 men. And on Ethan's side, 1 wounded man, 2 hired hands with the fire at their backs, and her. "Walker." Vance's voice rang across the yard, cracked and wild, nothing left in it of the smooth, cold neighbor. "You've ruined me. That old fool talked, and now it's all coming down, and it's your doing, you and that woman." His voice climbed towards something unhinged. "Well, if I'm to hang, I'll hang for something worth it. I'll burn this mountain to the rock, and I'll put you both in the ground first, and let them hang me. Let them. I don't care anymore. I don't care." "He's gone mad," Ethan gritted, hauling himself up against Charlotte's pistol in his good hand. "He's got nothing to lose now, and he knows it. Charlotte, listen to me." His face was gray with pain and loss of blood. "You take the wagon. You go. You ride for the marshal, and you leave me here." "Don't you dare," Charlotte said, low and fierce, sighting down the rifle. "Don't you dare tell me to leave you. I told you. I don't run. Now shut up and shoot straight." "I can barely lift the—" "Then rest it on my shoulder," Charlotte said, and she braced herself, planted like a rock, and Ethan laid his pistol arm across her shoulder to steady it. 2 of them, making 1 fighter, and across the yard, Vance screamed and kicked his horse forward, and his men came with him firing. What happened then happened faster than telling. Tom Brennan dropped his wet blanket and dove for the rifle, leaned against the corral, and came up shooting. Cole Perry took cover behind the water trough with his own pistol. Charlotte fired and levered and fired cool as her father had taught her at 9 years old on the Ohio flats. Breathe out and squeeze. Don't jerk. Don't hurry. The gun does the work, and Danvers's horse went down kicking and spilled him in the dirt. Ethan's pistol barked over her shoulder. Deafening, and the wounded hard case wheeled and broke and fled outright, wanting no more of it, galloping off down the road alone. And Sterling Vance came on. He came straight through the middle of it, through the smoke and the gunfire, straight for Charlotte and Ethan, his rifle up his face, a mask of ruin and hate, and Charlotte swung her barrel toward him and pulled the trigger, and the hammer fell on an empty chamber. Click. She was out. Time slowed to honey. She saw Vance see it. Saw him understand her rifle was empty. Saw the terrible triumph flare in his pale eyes as he leveled his own rifle at her, from 20 feet close enough not to miss, and she thought in that frozen slice of a second, not, I'm going to die, but I stood in front of Ethan. At least I stood in front of Ethan, at least. It's me and not him, and Ethan's pistol resting on her shoulder fired one last time. Sterling Vance rocked back in his saddle. The rifle fell from his hands. He looked down at himself with an expression of enormous surprise. And then up at the two of them. The mountain cowboy and the fat catalog bride standing together. One gun between them. Unbroken, and something like disbelief crossed his ruined face, that it should end this way, that he should be brought down by these two, these nobodies, these people he'd thought too small to matter. Then he slid sideways off his blood bay horse and fell into the dirt of Ethan Walker's yard, and he did not get up. The gunfire stopped. Danvers on foot, his horse dead, his boss down, threw his pistol away from him and put his hands high in the air. I'm done, he shouted, voice cracking. I quit, I'm done. Don't shoot. I'm done. I never signed on for murder. I swear before God, I never. Then get down on your face in the dirt and stay there, Tom Brennan shouted back, covering him, or I'll put you there myself. And Danvers dropped face down in the yard and lay still. And then there was only the crackle of the burning barn and the horses' fading panic, and Charlotte turning, dropping the empty rifle, catching Ethan as his knees buckled at last. Ethan! Ethan! She got him down easy, cradling him, tearing at his scorched shirt to find the wound. Let me see it. Shoulder? He gasped. Went through. I've had worse breaking horses. Charlotte? His hand came up and gripped her arm hard. The barn. The horses. Tom Cole. The horses, get them out and then leave the barn. Let it burn. Just save the stock, she shouted, and the hands ran to it, and she turned back to Ethan and pressed her hands hard over the wound to stop the blood, and his blood welled up warm between her fingers, and she said, fierce and shaking, You listen to me. You are not going to die. You hear? I did not cross a country and clean your filthy kitchen and beat a grass fire and face down a murderer to have you bleed out in the dirt now. You're going to live, Ethan Walker. You're going to live and marry me all over again just so I can be sure of it. Do you hear me? And Ethan Walker, gray-faced, bleeding, looked up at his wife, bent over him with his blood on her hands and terror and fury in her eyes, and the loneliest man in Montana did the last thing she expected. He laughed. Marry you all over again, he rasped. Woman, I'd marry you 100 times. His hand found her cheek and left a smear of blood there, and neither of them cared. You shot back. He shot me, and you, Charlotte, you stood over me, and you shot back. Of course I shot back. You're mine. She pressed harder on the wound, and tears were running down her face and dripping onto his chest. You're mine, and nobody takes what's mine, not Sterling Vance, not the devil himself. Now hold still and let me stop this bleeding before you ruin the whole speech by dying. By the time Jesse Crane came up the mountain, at the head of 6 armed deputies, riding hard, the barn was a smoking ruin, and the horses were safe in the corral. And Cole Danvers was trussed hand and foot in the dirt, and Sterling Vance lay dead in the yard under a saddle blanket, and Charlotte Walker sat in the doorway of the log house with her husband's head in her lap and his shoulder bound tight with strips of her own petticoat, both of them black with soot and streaked with blood and alive. Crane came off his horse before it had fully stopped. He took in the whole scene in one long marshal's glance, the dead man, the bound man, the burned barn, the bloody bandage, and his face. When he looked at Charlotte was something between awe and grief. The boy reached me, he said, told me what happened at the hotel. I came fast as horses could carry us. He crouched by Ethan. How bad? Through and through the shoulder, Charlotte said. He'll keep if we can get the doctor up here before it festers. I brought one. Left him at the foot of the mountain with an escort, wasn't sure what we'd ride into. Crane signaled a deputy who wheeled and galloped back down for the doctor. Then he looked at the blanket-covered shape in the yard. That's Vance. Ethan said, weak but clear. He come up here to burn me out and kill us both. Said if he was going to hang anyway, he'd take us with him. My wife. He stopped, and his voice, when it came again, was thick. My wife stood over me when I was down and fought 3 armed men. And when her rifle went empty and Vance had me dead to rights, he couldn't finish. I steadied his gun arm, Charlotte said simply. Ethan did the rest. It was self-defense. Marshall plain as plain. And there's 3 witnesses'll swear to it, and a bound man over there who'll tell you Vance came up here raving about killing us. I'll tell you anything you want, came Danvers's voice from the dirt desperate. Everything. All of it. Vance and Harmon and the forgeries and the Ackerley killing, I'll swear to all of it, just I never killed anybody. I want that on the record. I roughed men up, but I never killed. That was Vance and Vance alone. We'll get your statement, Crane said grimly. All of it. Every man's. He looked back down at Charlotte and Ethan. You won't need it to save yourselves, though. Not after today. Not after that hotel. He shook his head slowly, wonderingly. Mrs. Walker, do you understand what you did down there? Old Pettigrew's talking a blue streak. My deputy took his statement not an hour ago. Names, dates, forgeries going back 9 years. The Ackerleys, the Combses, the Duncan place. The Reyes family, every single one Vance stole with forged paper. And Pettigrew swears Vance as good as confessed to Ackerley's murder right there in the dining room in front of 40 people when he threatened your life. Crane's jaw tightened. You didn't just save your own home, ma'am. You cracked open 9 years of theft and murder that this whole valley knew about, and nobody had the sand to fight. You did it. A woman this town wouldn't give a cup of water to. Charlotte looked down at Ethan's face in her lap and smoothed his soot-black hair back with a bloody hand, and she didn't answer the marshal right away. I didn't do it to be a hero, she said, finally quiet. I did it because a woman named Ruth Ackerley carried her murdered husband alone for 9 years, and nobody would listen to her because she was poor and plain and washed hotel sheets for a living. And I know what that's like, Marshall. To be somebody the world's decided doesn't count. She lifted her chin. I couldn't give her Samuel back, but I could make her count. I could make all of them count. That's all I did. I made the people nobody would listen to loud enough that they couldn't be ignored anymore. Crane took off his hat. Well, he said, you did that, ma'am. You surely did that. The doctor came and dug the bullet's leavings from Ethan's shoulder, while Charlotte held his hand, and he cursed a blue streak and gripped her fingers hard enough to bruise, and the wound was clean and would heal. The deputies took Danvers away in irons and took Vance's body down the mountain and rode off to Red Hollow to arrest the bank officer Harmon and the sheriff who'd called Samuel Ackerley's murder an accident 9 years before, and to serve papers on Sterling Vance's whole rotten kingdom. And that night, for the first time in a long time, the ranch was quiet in a good way. Ethan lay in their bed, pale and bandaged, and dosed with the doctor's laudanum, and Charlotte sat beside him in the lamplight and wouldn't leave, wouldn't sleep, just sat and watched him breathe and held his good hand. Somewhere in the small hours he stirred and his eyes opened and he looked at her. You're still here, he murmured. Where else would I be? Thought I dreamed it, the shooting. You standing over me. His hand tightened on hers. Charlotte, I have to say a thing and the laudanum's got my tongue loose, so I'll say it while I can. He swallowed. When Vance had that rifle on you, when your gun clicked empty, and he leveled on you in that 1 second, I thought I was going to watch you die. And I want you to know what went through me, because it weren't fear. I've been afraid before. This was worse than afraid. His eyes were wet and bright in the lamplight. It was like watching the sun get shot out of the sky. Like the whole world was about to go dark forever, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. And I understood in that second exactly how much His voice broke. How much I love you, Charlotte Walker. I love you so much, it near stopped my heart to think of losing you. And I've never said it out loud. 16 years I told myself I didn't have it in me anymore, the loving. That it was burned out of me. And it wasn't. It was just waiting. It was waiting for you. Charlotte brought his rough hand up to her lips and kissed it, and the tears ran down her face freely now. I love you too, she whispered. I loved you the minute you filled my water cup in front of that whole mean town. I'd been alone my whole life, Ethan, and told my whole life I was too much and not enough both at once. And then a stranger took off his hat to me in the street and asked if I was tired. She laughed through her tears. That's all it took. One kind man asking if I was tired. I'd have followed you up any mountain in the world after that. You're not too much, Ethan said fierce even through the laudanum haze. You hear me? Not too much and not too little. You're exactly right. You're exactly the thing this empty place needed. The thing I needed. The thing I'd quit letting myself hope for. And I'm going to spend every day I've got left making sure you never doubt it. I swear it. I swear it to you. Hush now, Charlotte said gently, though her heart was full to bursting. Save your strength. There'll be plenty of days for swearing things. We've got the rest of our lives, remember. You promised to marry me 100 times. 100 times. Ethan agreed, drifting now. And I'll build you a new barn, better than the old one. We'll build it together. Together, he murmured, and his eyes fell closed, and his breathing went deep and easy, and Charlotte sat and held his hand through the rest of the night, watching over the man she loved, safe at last both of them, on the high mountain under the summer stars. But the reckoning was not quite finished, for there was one more soul the storm had swept up, and Charlotte had not forgotten her. 3 days later, when Ethan was well enough to sit up and take broth, and complain about being made to rest, Ruth Ackerley came up the mountain in a borrowed wagon, and she was not alone. Word had gone through the county like wildfire. Vance dead. Harmon arrested the sheriff, jailed the whole rotten structure of 9 years crashing down, and the families. The scattered, broken families Vance had ruined had begun to hear that it was over, that somebody had finally stood up, that the paper trail was found, and the murderer was dead, and the stolen land might come back, and Ruth had come to say thank you. But she'd brought more than thanks. She'd brought 2 others, a gaunt man named Combs, who'd lost his place to a forged foreclosure and gone to breaking rock for wages, and a young Mexican woman, Elena Reyes, whose father had been driven off his land and died of the shame of it, and they stood in the yard of the Walker Ranch, these ruined people, and they looked at Charlotte like she was something holy. Marshall Crane says the land might come back. Ruth said, her voice trembling. Says if the deeds was forged, they was never legal, and the land was never truly Vance's to sell nor keep, and it might come back to us, to all of us, that we might go home. She could barely get the words out. 9 years I've washed other folks' sheets, Charlotte. 9 years I've slept in a rented room and grieved my Samuel, and thought there weren't no justice in this world, not for the likes of me. And now they're telling me I might go home, that my boys might have their father's land back. She broke then, and Charlotte crossed the yard and took her in her arms, and the 2 women held each other, and the gaunt man Combs stood by with his hat crushed in his hands, and wept openly, and young Elena Reyes knelt in the dirt and thanked God out loud in Spanish. You go home, Ruth, Charlotte said, holding her tight. You go home, and you take your boys, and you plant Samuel's land, and every harvest you bring in is going to be justice. You hear? Every crop that comes up out of that ground is Sterling Vance losing over and over for the rest of your life. That's how you win against a man like that. You live good on the land he tried to steal, and you love your children on it, and you grow old on it, and you let his name rot while yours grows green. She pulled back and held the woman's thin face in her hands. You made this happen, Ruth, not me. You. You're the one who was brave enough to whisper the truth to a stranger in a wash yard. Everything since came from that. From you deciding to trust me. Don't you ever let anybody tell you you didn't count. You counted more than all of them. And Ruth Ackerley, who had carried a murdered husband and a stolen home, and 9 years of being no one, wept in the arms of the fat catalog bride. The whole valley had laughed at, and it was the sound of a soul setting down a burden it had carried too long and too far. Ethan watched it all from the porch chair Charlotte had set him in, wrapped in a blanket against her orders to rest, and when the ruined families had gone back down the mountain with hope in them for the first time in years, he reached out his good hand, and Charlotte came and sat on the arm of his chair and let him pull her close against his uninjured side. You see what you did, he said quietly. You see it. You didn't just beat Vance. You gave all of them their lives back. Every family he ever broke. We did it, Charlotte said. You and Pettigrew and Ruth and Tom and Cole and the whole town that finally found its backbone. You just were the one who wouldn't quit, Ethan said. The one who wouldn't run when Vance threatened you, wouldn't quit when the barn burned, wouldn't leave me in the dirt when any sensible person would have saved themselves. You were the spine of the whole thing, Charlotte. From the minute you hauled your own trunks off that stagecoach because a town wouldn't help you. He turned her face to his. You know what I think about sometimes? I think about all those years the world spent telling you that you didn't matter. Telling you that you were too big, too plain, too much, not worth a cup of water. And I think about how wrong they all were. Every last one of them. Because it turns out you were the one, the only one in this whole valley, with a heart big enough and a spine strong enough to bring down the man that had them all cowed. His thumb traced her cheek. They looked at your body and thought they knew you. They never once saw what you really were. And what was I really? Charlotte asked softly. Ethan Walker looked at his wife in the golden mountain evening, and he said with the whole of his heart, the bravest, kindest, strongest soul I ever knew, and the best thing that ever happened to this mountain or to me. And I thank God every hour of every day that a stagecoach came up a dusty street 2 months ago, and you were on it, and I was the one lucky enough to be there when you stepped down. I was the one lucky enough to be there when you stepped down, Ethan had said. And Charlotte carried those words in her heart all through the long autumn of Ethan's healing and into the winter. And the winter was where the world tried her one last time. The trial came first in October, before the snow. They took Charlotte down to the territorial court in Helena to testify, and she stood up in a full courtroom in her one good blue dress and told it all the water she'd been refused the threat in the yard, the fire she'd fought, the murder. Vance had all but confessed in the hotel, and Vance's lawyers were dead and his kingdom in ruins. But Harmon, the bank officer, had his own slick attorney, and that attorney rose and looked at Charlotte with a curl to his lip and tried the only thing left to him. He tried to make the jury see what Red Hollow had once seen. Mrs. Walker, the lawyer said smoothly, you're asking this court to hang a great deal on the word of a mail-order bride. A woman who came to this territory site unseen, ordered from a catalog like a bolt of cloth. A woman who, if the records to be believed, was thought so unsuitable that the very town laughed her off the stagecoach. He smiled thinly. Why should 12 good men believe a word from a woman like you? The courtroom held its breath. And Charlotte, who had been asked her whole life to be smaller, to be quieter, to apologize for the space she took up in the world, looked that lawyer dead in the eye and did not shrink 1 inch. You're right, she said, clear enough to carry to the last row. The town did laugh at me. They took one look and decided they knew everything about me worth knowing. She turned to the jury. That's exactly what Sterling Vance counted on. He counted on the whole world doing what that lawyer's doing right now, looking at a plain fat woman and deciding her word don't count. He murdered a man named Samuel Ackerley, and he stole from a dozen families, and he got away with it for 9 years, because every witness against him was somebody the world had already decided didn't matter. The poor, the widowed, the washwomen and the tenant farmers and the foreigners. Vance built his whole crooked empire on the notion that certain kinds of people can be ignored. She let it sit. Well, I'm one of those people, and I'm here to tell you that we count. Ruth Ackerley's grief counts. Ned Pettigrew's 40 years of watching counts. Samuel Ackerley's life counted. And you can look at me and see a catalog bride if you want to, or you can look at the forged deeds and the bank records and the sworn word of 11 ruined families, and you can see the truth. It's all there. I'm just the one who wouldn't stop saying it out loud. The jury was out 40 minutes. Harmon got 15 years. The crooked sheriff got 10. And the judge, an old hard man who'd seen 1,000 liars pass through his court, stopped Charlotte on her way out and said low, just for her, in 30 years on the bench, ma'am, I never heard a truer witness. Your town was a pack of fools. And Charlotte thanked him kindly and said she reckoned the town was learning better, and she went home to her mountain. And she was right. The town was learning better, By the time the first snow came, Charlotte Walker could not walk down the main street of Red Hollow without being stopped a dozen times by the mother who'd once yanked her boy away and now pressed a jar of preserves into her hands with shining eyes, by the men who'd laughed on the saloon steps and now tipped their hats so fast and so deep they near fell over, by little Danny grown an inch, who ran to her every Saturday, hollering, "Mrs. Walker, Mrs. Walker," and got a peppermint every time. The woman with the blue fan. Marion, who'd said Charlotte was strong as an ox, that woman came to the ranch one day, alone in her fine dress, and stood in the yard, and could hardly get the words out. "I said a cruel thing about you," Marion said, twisting her gloves. "The day you came. I said it doesn't matter what I said, it was cruel, and you heard it. I know you heard it. And I've been ashamed of it every day since, more so after everything you did for this valley." She lifted her chin with visible effort. "I came to say I'm sorry, and to ask—" Her voice wavered. "My husband's people lost their farm to Vance years back, before I married in. And I wondered if you might tell me how to reach that marshal, about getting it looked into, whether it might come back." And Charlotte, who could have turned that woman away with every justification in the world, instead took her by the arm and walked her inside and sat her down at the kitchen table and poured her coffee and helped her write out everything she knew about her husband's family's lost farm and sent it to Crane herself. "Why?" Marion asked when it was done near tears. "After what I said. Why help me?" "Because holding a grudge is just carrying a weight that only hurts the one carrying it," Charlotte said simply. "And I've carried enough heavy things in my life without adding your unkind words to the load. You said you're sorry. It's done. Now let's get your husband's people their land back and be friends, because I could use a friend in town, and you make fine preserves, I've heard." Marion Whitfield laughed and cried at the same time and left the mountain, a different woman than she'd come, and told the story all over Red Hollow. And that was one more soul turned, one more heart softened, until the whole town seemed almost to be competing to prove they'd never really been the sort to laugh at a tired woman asking for water. The land did come back. Not all of it. Not all at once, the law ground slow, but that winter and the spring after, one family at a time. The forged deeds were struck down and the stolen homes restored. Ruth Ackerley went home to the Two Rivers bottom land with her 3 boys, and she planted it that spring. And the first letter she sent up the mountain to Charlotte was blotched with tears, and said only that her eldest boy, near grown now, had stood in the middle of his father's field at dawn and wept, and then picked up the plow, and that Samuel would have been so proud, and that none of it would have happened without a stranger who took the other end of a laundry basket on a hot day and said, "I listen." Charlotte kept every letter. There got to be a great many of them. But the mountain tested them yet, because a Montana winter tests everything, and this one came hard and early and mean. Ethan's shoulder had healed, but it ached in the cold, and the snows came deep as the little boy in town had promised, deep enough to bury fences. And there was a stretch in January when the cold sank so low the cattle bunched and drifted, and a man could freeze to death 50 feet from his own door. And it was in the worst of that cold, in the dead heart of the winter, that the last hard thing came, not from Vance, who was in the ground, and not from the town which had come around, but from the mountain itself, and from the past, and from the deepest fear Ethan Walker carried. Charlotte was carrying a child. She'd known since November, and told Ethan on Christmas morning, and watched the loneliest man in Montana go so pale and so still that she'd been frightened until she understood it wasn't the fear of a man who didn't want the child. It was the fear of a man who wanted it so much and had lost so much that hope itself had become a kind of terror to him. "My mother," he'd said hoarsely that Christmas morning, holding her hands too tight. "My mother died young. The winter sickness. And Susanna, there was talk the country's hard on women in the birthing, and up here so far from any doctor in the snow." He couldn't finish. "Charlotte, I can't lose you. I told you what it did to me just to think it in that yard. If I lost you to this, to giving me a child, I couldn't bear it. I couldn't. It would finish me." Ethan Walker. She'd taken his terrified face in her hands. "Listen to me. Women have babies on this frontier every day. Strong women. And I am the strongest woman you or anybody else ever met. You've said so yourself. I fought a fire and a murderer and a whole mean town, and I'm still standing. You think a baby's going to be the thing that finishes me?" She'd smiled at him, fierce and tender. "I'm going to have this child, and I'm going to be fine. And you're going to hold your son or your daughter in those big hands, and all that hope you've been so scared of is going to come true. And you're going to learn what I already know, that the good things are worth the fear of losing them. That's the whole secret of it, Ethan. The good things are worth the fear. You just have to be brave enough to hope." And he'd wept and held her and been afraid all winter long. But he'd let himself hope too, which was the bravest thing she'd ever seen him do, braver than facing down Vance, because for a man who'd trained himself 16 years not to want anything, letting himself want a child and a wife and a future was the hardest courage of all. The baby came in April with the first thaw, and it did not come easy. The labor was long, and the doctor was 2 hours down, a still treacherous road, and Tom Brennan rode for him through mud and half-melted snow, while Ethan paced the cabin like a caged thing, useless, gray-faced and old. Ruth Ackerley, who'd come up the mountain the week before, sworn she'd be there, said she'd birthed her own 3 and half the babies in 2 rivers besides, and wasn't about to let Charlotte do it alone. Ruth ran the whole thing calm and sure, and shooed Ethan out when his fear filled the room too full. It was a long, hard day, and a longer night, and near dawn when Ethan had worn a path in the floor, and prayed more prayers than he'd prayed in his whole life put together. Prayed to the God he'd stopped speaking to when his folks died. Prayed not her. Take anything. Not her. Near dawn, a new sound came through the cabin wall. A baby's cry. Ethan Walker stood frozen in the middle of the floor. And then Ruth's voice, spent and joyful. "It's a girl, Ethan. A fine, strong girl, loud as a steam whistle, and Charlotte's fine. She's tired and she's fine. Come in and meet your daughter." He couldn't move. For one whole moment, the fear had him so hard he couldn't move. The old fear, the 16 years fear, the good things get taken. Don't go in. Don't look. Don't love it, because loving it is how it destroys you. And then he heard Charlotte's voice, weak and worn, but unmistakably gloriously alive, calling through the door. "Ethan Walker, you get in here and hold your daughter this minute, or I'll get up and fetch you myself, and I just had a baby, so don't you dare make me." And that broke the fear's grip clean, because it was so exactly her, and he laughed with tears streaming down his weathered face, and he went in. Charlotte lay propped in their bed, gray with exhaustion, and shining with something no exhaustion could dim, and in her arms was a small, furious red bundle with a shock of dark hair, and Ethan crossed the room on legs that shook and sank down beside them both, and Charlotte laid the baby in his enormous, careful hands. The same hands that had filled a water cup, that had steadied a gun on her shoulder, that had dug 2 graves in frozen ground, and thought they'd never hold anything precious again. And Ethan Walker looked down at his daughter, and he came apart entirely. "She's so small," he whispered. "Charlotte, she's so small, look at her." "She's not small, she's 8 pounds if she's an ounce," Ruth says. "And I'll thank you to remember I know it," Charlotte said, laughing weakly. "But she's ours. Look at her, Ethan. Look what we made. Look what came out of a stagecoach ride and a cup of water." Ethan couldn't speak. He held his daughter, and he wept, the tears falling into her dark hair. And finally he got the words out, ragged and whole. "I want to name her for my mother, Sarah, if that suits you." "Sarah Walker," Charlotte said softly. "It suits me fine." "Sarah!" He tried it on his tongue. This name he'd buried under a pine tree 16 years before, brought back now into the living world in a warm bundle in his arms. "Sarah, my mother would have—" His voice failed. "She'd have loved you so, Charlotte. She'd have loved you so much, both of you. She always wanted—" He shook his head, unable. "This house was so full of death for so long. My folks in the ground behind it. All that grief. And now there's this. There's a baby crying in it. There's life." He looked up at his wife, streaming undone. "You brought life back to this whole mountain, Charlotte. You brought it back to me. I was as dead as anything under that pine tree when you found me, and you brought me back to life." "We brought each other back," Charlotte whispered, reaching to touch his face and their daughter, and the three of them together. "That's what love is, Ethan. I didn't save you, and you didn't save me. We saw each other. When nobody else would look, we looked. And we saw. And that's the whole of it. That's everything." The years came on the way years do, and they were good years, the best either of them had ever known or dared to dream of. Sarah grew dark-haired and strong and fearless, and a brother came 2 years behind her. Samuel, named for Ruth's murdered husband at Charlotte's asking, and Ruth's weeping blessing, and the log house that had held one silent, lonely man for 16 years, rang now from dawn to dark with the noise of children and the smell of Charlotte's cooking and the sound of a woman singing while she worked. And Ethan Walker, who had once trusted horses more than people learned to trust in happiness itself, which was harder, and learned it well. The ranch prospered, but that was the least of what it became, because Charlotte never forgot what it was to be turned away, and she built the Walker place into something the whole country came to know, not for its cattle or its high cold water, though those made them comfortable, but for its open door. Any soul who came up that mountain hungry got fed. Any woman running from a hard situation got shelter and no questions. Charlotte taught the girls of the valley, the poor ones, the plain ones, the ones the world had already decided didn't count. She taught them to cook and to garden and to keep accounts and to shoot straight and to hold their chins level when the world tried to make them small. Dozens of them over the years. Ruth Ackerley's own granddaughters among them. "Why do you do it?" A young woman asked her once, years on a girl who'd come up the mountain, thin and frightened and ashamed of her own body, the way Charlotte had once been shamed. "You've got your own family, your own place. Why take in every stray in the county?" And Charlotte Gray now at the temples, her hands more scarred and more gentle than ever, looked at the frightened girl and said what she'd learned in a lifetime of being looked at wrong. "Because a long time ago I stepped off a stagecoach into a town that decided it knew everything about me from the size of my body. Not one of them saw me. Not one of them saw a single true thing about who I was. And I stood there in the dust, and I thought I was the most alone person in the whole wide world." She took the girl's hands. "And then one man took off his hat and asked if I was tired. That's all. One person who looked past what everybody else stopped at and saw a real person there, worth a cup of water and a kind word. And that one thing changed my whole life. It saved my whole life." Her eyes shone. "So that's why. Because I know what it does to a body to finally be seen. And I aim to do that for as many souls as I can before I'm done the way it was done for me. That's the whole of my philosophy, child. Look at people. Really look. Everybody's carrying something, and everybody's worth more than the first thing you see." And the girl wept and stayed and was seen and went on years later to see others in her turn. And that was how it spread. The thing Charlotte started out and out across the years, like ripples on the high cold water, one seen soul seeing the next. One evening in her later years, the children grown. Sarah married to a good man down the valley. Samuel running the ranch now with his father's easy hand. Charlotte and Ethan sat together on the porch of the log house as they had 10,000 evenings. His arm around her, her head on his shoulder. Both of them gone gray and slow and easy, watching the light change on the mountains they'd defended and the land they'd made a sanctuary. "You know what I was thinking about," Ethan said, his voice roughened by the years, but his hand as warm in hers as it had been the first day. "That fool lawyer at the trial, all those years back, asking why anybody should believe a word from a woman like you." He shook his head slowly. "A woman like you." He meant it cruel. And I've thought about it my whole life since that phrase, because he had it exactly backwards. "A woman like you." He turned and looked at her, this face he'd loved for 30 years and more. "There's not another woman like you, Charlotte. There never was and there never will be. The whole valley knows it now. They name their daughters after you. They tell their children stories about the woman who stood up to Sterling Vance and gave the ruined families back their homes. A woman like you." His eyes were wet the way they'd been wet the first night she cooked him supper in his cold kitchen. There's only ever been the one. Charlotte reached up and touched his weathered cheek the way she had 10,000 times. They looked at me and thought I was too big to matter, she said softly. Too big to love. Too much and not enough. My whole life, that's what the world told me. She smiled, and there was no bitterness in it, none at all, only a deep and settled peace. And I want to tell you something I finally understand, Ethan, after all these years, that I wish I could go back and tell that scared girl stepping off the stagecoach in the dust. She was never too big. There was nothing wrong with her at all. The world just hadn't learned yet how to see her. She looked out at the mountains, at the land full of children and animals, and life at the sanctuary they'd built out of grief and cruelty and a single cup of water. A woman's worth was never measured by the size of her body. It was always only ever measured by the size of her heart. And mine was big enough to hold this whole mountain. Big enough to hold all of them. Big enough to hold you. She turned to him and took his old hand in both of hers, the hand that had held out water to a thirsty stranger a lifetime ago. I spent my whole young life being told I was too much, and it turns out I was exactly enough. I was exactly, precisely, perfectly enough for this life, and this land, and this love, and this man. And that is the truest thing I know, and I know it all the way down to the bone, and no one will ever tell me different again. Ethan Walker lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it, the scarred hand she'd once hidden because the world had judged it, and he held it against his heart as the sun went down, gold and slow behind the mountains they had saved together. Exactly enough, he said. You were always exactly enough. And I thank God every single day of my life that I was standing in that street when you stepped down, and that I had the sense for once to see what was right in front of me. He drew her close. You came up this mountain, a woman the whole world had rejected, and you turned it into the one place on earth where nobody ever gets rejected again. That's your life, Charlotte Walker. That's what you built. That's what you were always worth. And Charlotte Walker rested her gray head on the shoulder of the man who had seen her when no one else would, in the home they had made a refuge for every soul the world threw away, and she closed her eyes, and she was at long and perfect last exactly where she belonged.